First, let's talk about how smell works. From coffee to stinky trash, the substances around us give off volatiles, which you can think of as tiny smell molecules. We breathe in these smell molecules, which then stimulate the olfactory sensory neurons that sit high in the nose. Each of these neurons contains an odor receptor on its surface. Once the odor receptors are triggered by these smell molecules, the neurons send information about them to the brain. Here's what I think is so cool. The brain not only categorizes that information as a particular odor, it may also begin to associate feelings like pleasure or disgust and other moods and emotions with that odor for future reference. For example, you sniff bacon. You eat it, your taste buds get salt, and then your body gets a whack of fat, which is an energy source. So the brain loves it and attaches a positive label to it. The next time you smell bacon, a sensation associated with pleasure arises.
We know from history that every major industrial disruption has followed the same shape, an exponential curve, with new technologies being adopted very slowly at first, but then a doubling rate kicking in consistently until the overall transformation happens very quickly in the end. It's a movie we've seen many times before, whether from horses to cars, from valves to transistors, or landlines to mobile phones. And we understand how it works. Initially, the cost of technology is high, but as we learn through volume adoption, the cost goes down and adoption goes up. Best example right now would be electric batteries, consistently coming down in cost by 20% a year for the last 10 years. And as the volume of adoption grows, especially with electric vehicle sales growing, we can be confident that the costs of that technology will continue to go down, driving that exponential growth. We set these exponential goals because we believe in the power of human innovation. Engineers love these goals, these stretch targets. It's what they live for.
Unlike the moon, our dead rocky companion, the Earth is alive, pulsing with creative and destructive forces that power its geological metabolism. Lunar rocks brought back by the Apollo astronauts all date back to about the age of the solar system. Moon rocks are forever. Earth rocks, on the other hand, face the perils of a living lithosphere. All will suffer ruination through some combination of mutilation, compression, folding, tearing, scorching, and baking. Thus, the volumes of Earth history are incomplete and disheveled. The library is vast and magnificent, but decrepit. And it was this tattered complexity in the rock record that obscured its meaning until relatively recently. Nature provided no card catalog for geologists. This would have to be invented. 5,000 years after the Sumerians learned to record their thoughts on clay tablets, the Earth's volumes remained inscrutable to humans. We were geologically illiterate, unaware of the antiquity of our own planet, and ignorant of our connection to deep time. It wasn't until the turn of the 19th century that our blinders were removed.
Now, typically, when we think about business, we use what I call mechanical thinking. We set goals, we analyze problems, we construct and we adhere to plans, and more than anything else, we stress efficiency and short-term performance. And don't get me wrong, this is a splendidly practical and effective way of addressing relatively simple challenges in relatively stable environments. It's the way that Bob, and probably many of us, myself included, process most business problems we're faced with every day. In fact, it was a pretty good mental model for business overall until about the mid-1980s, when the conjunction of globalization and a revolution in technology and telecommunications made business far more dynamic and unpredictable. But what about those more dynamic and unpredictable situations that we now increasingly face? I think in addition to the mechanical thinking, we now need to master the art of biological thinking, as embodied by our 6 principles. In other words, we need to think more modestly and subtly about when and how we can shape, rather than control, unpredictable and complex situations.
I kept thinking, Why does the item have to be returned to the retailer in the first place? What if there was another way? A win-win for everyone. What if, when a person is trying to return something, it could go to the next shopper who wants it and not the retailer? What if, instead of a return, they could do what I call a green turn? Consumers could use an app to take pictures of the item and verify the condition while returning it. Artificial intelligence systems could then sort these clothes by condition, mint conditioned or slightly used, and direct it to the next appropriate person. Mint conditioned clothes could automatically go to the next buyer, while slightly used clothes could be marked down and offered online again. The retailer can decide the business rules on the number of times a particular item can be resold. All that the consumer would need to do is obtain a mobile code, take it to the nearest shipping place to be packed and shipped, and off it goes from one buyer to the next, not the landfill. Now you will ask, would people really go through all this trouble? I think they would if they had incentives, like loyalty points or cashback. Let's call it green cash. There would be a whole new opportunity to make money from this new customer base looking to buy these returns. This system would make a fun thing like shopping a spiritual experience that helps save our planet.
How are we raising our children? Are we raising them for now instead of yet? Are we raising kids who are obsessed with getting A's? Are we raising kids who don't know how to dream big dreams? Their biggest goal is getting the next A or the next test score? And are they carrying this need for constant validation with them into their future lives? Maybe because employers are coming to me and saying, we have already raised a generation of young workers who can't get through the day without an award. So, what can we do? How can we build that bridge to yet? Here are some things we can do. First of all, we can praise wisely, not praising intelligence or talent. That has failed. Don't do that anymore, but praising the process that kids engage in, their effort, their strategies, their focus, their perseverance, their improvement. This process praise creates kids who are hardy and resilient. There are other ways to reward yet. We recently teamed up with game scientists from the University of Washington to create a new online math game that rewarded yet. In this game, students were rewarded for effort, strategy, and progress. The usual math game rewards you for getting answers right now, but this game rewarded process. And we got more effort, more strategies, more engagement over longer periods of time, and more perseverance when they hit really, really hard problems. Just the words yet or not yet, we're finding, give kids greater confidence, give them a path into the future that creates greater persistence. And we can actually change students' mindsets.
Our society is just more and more mobile. Everything is on the move. I mean, the good part is it's convenient. You can drink coffee anywhere. You don't have to stay in the diner. You can be in the subway. You can be walking. The bad part is it's harder to savor a coffee when you're taking it on the road. The first patent for a lid on a cup was in 1934, but it was for cold beverages. And in 1950, this guy named James Ruff-Snyder invented the first snap-on lid, but it didn't have an opening for drinking. In the 60s, there was this huge cultural shift where people started drinking coffee on the move. And 7-Eleven was the first to sell coffee to go. And then came this revolution in 1967. A man named Alan Frank invented a lid that you could peel a tab off, like in the shape of a guitar pick, and drink it from there. In 1975, another big advance, you could peel back a tab and attach it to the lid itself. So more and more people started drinking coffee on the go. In 1984, a watershed moment in the history of coffee cup lids, the birth of the Traveler lid. And it is iconic. You've seen it a million times. And it solved a whole host of problems. It's designed so that you don't splash your face because it's higher than any of the other ones. It's got this protruding rim, so it slightly cools the coffee before it hits your lips. It's got a small depression in the center for your nose, so you can really get in there and get maximum aroma. It's got this tiny air hole that lets the steam out and stops it from creating a vacuum. This is one of those objects where you just don't notice it until it dribbles on your lap. So I think the coffee cup lid will just continue to evolve. And you're going to see a move away from single-use plastic lids to lids that are a little more sustainable.
We can fertilize our food. Each one of us is pooping and peeing something that could fertilize half or maybe all of our food, depending on our diet. It's dark brown because of what? Dead stuff, bacteria. That's carbon. And carbon, if we're getting that into the soil, it's going to bind to the other minerals and nutrients in there. Boom, healthier food. Voila, healthier people. And chemical fertilizers, by definition, don't have carbon in it. Imagine if we could move our animal manure and our human manure to our soil. We might not need to rely on fossil fuel-based fertilizers, mine minerals from far away. Imagine how much energy we could save. Now, some of us are concerned about industrial pollutants contaminating this reuse cycle. That can be addressed. But we need to separate our discomfort about talking about poo and pee so we can calmly talk about how we want to reuse it and what things we don't want to reuse. And get this. If we change our approach to sanitation, we can start to slow down climate change. Remember that carbon in the poop? If we can get that into our soil bank, it's going to start to absorb carbon dioxide that we put into the air. And that could help slow down global warming.
The comic move is to guide us to a benevolent conception of people, and hence parts of ourselves. Comedy also does a great job at reducing power imbalances. It's hugely reassuring to see the powerful laughing at themselves. Finding oneself comical is a token of maturity. It means being able to see one's faults without being too defensive about them. Humor often provides a mechanism whereby the powerless, or at least the less powerful, can give constructive but pointed feedback to the powerful. Monty Python was particularly focused on this task. The Philosopher's Football match mocks the great figures of intellectual history. It's funny because we've been intimidated so deeply in the past by intellectual bullies who made us feel small with their reading of Wittgenstein or Schopenhauer. And now they're shown as being completely rubbish at football and yet seriously involved in the game. Comedy isn't just a bit of fun. The comic perspective is a central need of a society. It enables us to cope much better with our own follies and disappointments, our troubles around work and love, and our difficulties enduring ourselves. Comedy is waiting to be reframed as a central tool in a better society.
The public realm in America has two roles. It is the dwelling place of our civilization and our civic life, and it is the physical manifestation of the common good. And when you degrade the public realm, you will automatically degrade the quality of your civic life and the character of all the enactments of your public life and communal life that take place there. The public realm comes mostly in the form of the street in America because we don't have the 1,000-year-old cathedral plazas and market squares of older cultures. Your ability to define space and to create places that are worth caring about all comes from a body of culture that we call the culture of civic design. This is a body of knowledge, method, skill, and principle that we threw in the garbage after World War II and decided we don't need that anymore, we're not going to use it. And consequently, we can see the result all around us. The public realm has to inform us not only where we are geographically, but it has to inform us where we are in our culture, where we've come from, what kind of people we are, and it needs to, by doing that, it needs to afford us a glimpse to where we're going, in order to allow us to dwell in a hopeful present.
Why are there so many jobs? There are actually two fundamental economic principles at stake. One has to do with human genius and creativity. The other has to do with human insatiability, or greed, if you like. I'm going to call the first of these the O-ring principle, and it determines the type of work that we do. The second principle is the never get enough principle, and it determines how many jobs there actually are. Let's start with the O-ring. ATMs, automated teller machines, had two countervailing effects on bank teller employment. As you'd expect, they replaced a lot of teller tasks. The number of tellers per branch fell by about a third. But banks quickly discovered it also was cheaper to open new branches, and the number of bank branches increased by about 40% in the same time period. The net result was more branches and more tellers. But those tellers were doing somewhat different work. As their routine cash handling tasks receded, they became less like checkout clerks and more like salespeople, forging relationships with customers, solving problems, and introducing them to new products like credit cards, loans, and investments. More tellers doing a more cognitively demanding job. There's a general principle here. Most of the work that we do requires a multiplicity of skills. And brains and brawn, technical expertise and intuitive mastery, perspiration and inspiration, in the words of Thomas Edison. In general, automating some subset of those tasks doesn't make the other ones unnecessary. In fact, it makes them more important. It increases their economic value.
Work comes to be the center around which the world turns. The human beings start to see themselves chiefly as workers, and the entirety of life becomes more and more work, or work-like. To see this, we can begin to examine a number of what I might call tightening conditions. So the first condition would be the centrality of work. We come to think that work is actually the center, and everything else begins to turn around it. That we are preparing for work, that we are preparing to leave work, and this is happening all the way around the world. Meanwhile, we're adjusting our schedules, the rest of our lives, so that they are turning about it. So that would be the first condition. The second condition is subordination, that everything else in life comes to seem as if it's subordinate to and to be put in the service of work. We can think of sleeping. Right? The idea is that we wish to sleep well today in order to be focused and prepared for work, and that when we're at work, we wish to be as productive as possible. So sleep becomes that which is an instrument in the service of productivity, and we can play that game with all sorts of different instances. The third condition is the resemblance claim. It seems as if everything else in life comes to resemble work more and more. So you can think of, on a day off, you're wanting to be as productive as possible, thinking about how much you got done. You can begin to think about all the ways in which you plan and schedule time with children. The terms that begin to mark out our lives, even when we're not actually working, sound more and more work-like. And the last condition, I think, is the most intense, and that's what I might call cultural forgetfulness. We've come to almost forget that there was a time in which work was not the center of the world, that there are other ways of life that precede the modern world in which work was a part of life, but was not the focus of life. We forget that that's still true today with other cultures, some other cultures, and we forget that there could actually be a time when work would not be that around which the rest of the world turns.
According to the literature on reality monitoring, stories based on imagined experiences are qualitatively different from those based on real experiences. This suggests that creating a false story about a personal topic takes work and results in a different pattern of language use. A technology known as linguistic text analysis has helped to identify 4 such common patterns in the subconscious language of deception. First, liars reference themselves less when making deceptive statements. They write or talk more about others, often using the third person to distance and disassociate themselves from their lie. Which sounds more false? Absolutely no party took place at this house, or I didn't host a party here. Second, liars tend to be more negative, because on a subconscious level, they feel guilty about lying. For example, a liar might say something like, "Sorry, my stupid phone battery died. I hate that thing." Third, liars typically explain events in simple terms, since our brains struggle to build a complex lie. Judgment and evaluation are complex things for our brains to compute. As a US president once famously insisted, "I did not have sexual relations with that woman." And finally, even though liars keep descriptions simple, they tend to use longer and more convoluted sentence structure, inserting unnecessary words and irrelevant but factual sounding details in order to pad the lie.
The modern fantasy about, wow, business is changing so quickly, you've got to keep morphing and changing, updating your brand, getting a new visual identity, all of those things, they're just bad. Bad, 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 bad. Don't do them. Why? It's because you interrupt habit. So rather than a consumer thinking about, oh, wow, I am loyal to, let's say, Tide. I'm loyal to Tide detergent. I really should buy it. It's actually that person's subconscious saying, you know, the most comfortable thing to do, the thing we in your subconscious are most confident of is that thing that worked for us before. So please, please, please don't think about buying something else. Tide's been around for 76 years, and it has what we call cumulative advantage. Cumulative advantage is what you increasingly build as the customer becomes more and more comfortable with using your product or service. Each time they use it and get the benefits they wish, you get more cumulative advantage that causes the subconscious to say, I'm totally comfortable with this, and I would be uncomfortable if we did something else. That's the win of cumulative advantage.
As Emerson once put it, in the minds of geniuses, we find, once more, our own neglected thoughts. It's almost certain that people who have devoted themselves to self-honesty and self-observation have an above-average chance of meeting with incomprehension, irritation, censorship, or boredom when they attempt to share the data from their own minds, frankly, in company. Their thoughts, it might be on politics or architecture, family life or sexuality, will sound more threatening, more intense, oblique or tender than is allowed. That feels lonely if one's in the mood to frame things like this. There are simply fewer people at large committed to self-honesty and self-observation, and therefore up for exchanging notes on what it's truly like to be alive. Yet there is one resource that is exceptionally well suited to addressing the feelings of disconnection liable to be felt by the emotionally intelligent: art. Works of art are humanity's secret diary, records of all that could not be said in regular social contexts, but which have found a home in the more intimate, honest communication that can take place between an artwork and its audience.
And there are many benefits of moral outrage, but there are also many costs. So the benefits can fall into two broad categories. The first category of benefit is social benefits. So when we express outrage about some kind of wrongdoing, that teaches others that that kind of behavior is not going to be tolerated, and it can motivate other people to behave morally so that they can avoid getting shamed or punished for breaking the rules. The other kind of benefit that moral outrage brings about is personal. Moral outrage broadcasts to the rest of your social group that you are the kind of person who's not likely to break the rules. So these two benefits of expressing outrage have to be balanced against the costs of outrage.
Walking is the most fundamental basic form of human physical activity. The average sort of hunter-gatherer will take 15,000 steps a day. The average American before the pandemic was taking something like 4,700 and something steps a day. Only about 20% of Americans get the very minimum levels of exercise that every healthy organization in the world thinks is the minimum for an adult, who is 150 minutes a week. So 80% of us really struggle and fail to get very basic amounts of exercise. but almost everyone says that they want to get enough exercise. We live in a world where we no longer have to be physically active. We now, in a very strange way, have to choose to be physically active. And that's not so easy, because there were no ellipticals and other kinds of machines back in the Stone Age. If you want to get your heart rate up, you probably were running. And one of the biggest myths about running is that it'll destroy your knees. There's tons and tons of studies, more than a dozen randomized, controlled perspective, gold standard studies, which show that people who run more are not more likely to get arthritis. In fact, lots of research shows that physical activities like running actually cause your joints to repair themselves and to stay healthy. The other kinds of running injuries, I think there's a lot of them that are caused because we don't learn how to run properly anymore. I think running is still a skill like swimming or throwing, all kinds of other things that we do. Over the past few months, the government has been pushing to remove all advertising outlets for the tobacco industry, and in particular for pushing plain packaging. The tobacco industry, however, are against this, and they in particular argue that the cigarette box is not a form of advertising. Michaela has been doing her PhD looking at cigarette advertising and how it's changed over the last 50 years. Basically, I've accessed advertising from the tobacco industry since the 1950s and just analyzed the images and look at the use of cigarette box within the adverts. In the very early adverts, the cigarette box is a very small part of the adverts, and they focus much more on the social aspect of smoking. However, as you move through the decades and get closer to the present day, the cigarette box became more and more of a focal point in the adverts. My argument is that the cigarette box has actually become iconic to each brand. So when a smoker takes a box out of their pocket, they're actually advertising that brand. So what we hope will come out of this is that the government will introduce plain packaging. And like Australia, who have already introduced its policy, and Ireland, who are again beginning to introduce its policy, we hope that the UK will stop cigarette companies from using their box as a form of advertising.
Awe is a powerful and transformative emotion. It's inspired great works of art, incited religious movements, and generated philosophical musings about the sublime. But despite this impressive resume, only very recently have we begun to study this emotion in psychology. So what is awe? I define it by its synonyms, wonder and amazement, and by its psychological experience. We feel awe when we encounter something vast and grand that challenges our worldview. It makes us feel small in the presence of something bigger than ourselves and connected with others around us. Now, you might be thinking that you have to travel to remote places in order to experience this emotion, but I can tell you that that's not the case. In fact, participants report feeling awe about twice a week on average, making it a more common emotion than you might expect. We feel awe when we hear beautiful music, when we look up at the night sky and see the stars, or when we watch athletes achieve feats that we thought were beyond reality. So here's the question. Why would awe be a better predictor of good health than other positive emotions? We don't yet know. It may be because awe is particularly potent at reducing stress or increasing feelings of social connection. It may be because awe generates a desire to engage or explore the world around us. Recent work suggests that awe promotes greater humility, prosociality, and well-being. And all of these things could impact physical health.
If you actually want to make a difference, you have to do something. And we've learned there are 3 key ways. The first is we have to educate for body confidence. We have to help our teenagers develop strategies to overcome image-related pressures and build their self-esteem. Now, the good news is that there are many programs out there available to do this. The bad news is that most of them don't work. I was shocked to learn that many well-meaning programs are inadvertently actually making the situation worse. So we need to make damn sure that the programs that our kids are receiving are not only having a positive impact, but having a lasting impact as well. And the research shows that the best programs address 6 key areas. The first is the influence of family, friends, and relationships. The second is media and celebrity culture. Then how to handle teasing and bullying. The way we compete and compare with one another based on looks. Talking about appearance. Some people call this body talk or fat talk. And finally, the foundations of respecting and looking after yourself. These 6 themes are crucial starting points for anyone serious about delivering body confidence education that works. And education is critical, but tackling this problem is going to require each and every one of us to step up and be better role models for the women and girls in our own lives, challenging the status quo of how women are seen and talked about in our own circles.
The good news is that there's treatment for anxiety and that you don't have to suffer. Remember, this isn't about weakness, it's about changing brain patterns. And research shows that our brains have the ability to reorganize and form new connections all throughout our lives. A good first step is to do the basics. Eat a balanced diet, exercise regularly, and get plenty of sleep, as your mind is part of your body. It might also help to try meditation. Instead of our heart rate rising and our body tensing, with mindfulness and breathing, we can slow down the fight or flight response and improve how we feel in the moment. Cognitive behavioral therapy, a form of talk therapy, can also be fantastic. In it, you learn to identify upsetting thoughts and determine whether they're realistic. Over time, cognitive behavioral therapy can rebuild those neural pathways that tamp down the anxiety response. Medication can also give relief in both the short term and the long term. In the short term, anti-anxiety drugs can downregulate the threat detection mechanisms that are going into overdrive. Studies have shown that both long-term medications and cognitive behavioral therapy can reduce that overreactivity of the amygdala we see in anxiety disorders. High blood pressure and diabetes, they can be treated or managed over time, and the same is true for an anxiety disorder too.
Plans called detoxification diets either promote or restrict certain foods to provide specific nutrients in high quantities. These can be useful for addressing some nutritional problems, but they're far too specific to be used as general cure-alls. For example, for a person with low vitamin A, a juice diet might be helpful, but for someone high in vitamin A, juicing could be disastrous. And regardless of personal nutrition, maintaining a juice diet over multiple weeks is likely to compromise the immune system due to a lack of essential fats and proteins. Therein lies the problem with all these fast-moving diets. Whether you're cutting calories or food groups, extreme diets are a shock to your system. There are well-established rates of healthy weight loss motivated by both diet and exercise that account for genetic and medical differences. And staying on those timelines requires a dietary lifestyle that's sustainable. In fact, some of the worst side effects of extreme diets are rarely discussed since so few people stick with them. It also bears mentioning that many societies have unhealthy relationships with weight, and people are often pressured to diet for reasons other than health or happiness. So rather than trying to lose weight fast, we should all be taking our time to figure out what the healthiest lifestyle is for ourselves.
In 1790, about 3,000 bales of cotton were produced in America each year. A bale was equal to about 500 pounds. By 1801, with the spread of the cotton gin, cotton production grew to 100,000 bales a year. After the disruptions of the War of 1812, production reached 400,000 bales a year. As America was expanding through the land acquired in the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, yearly production exploded to 4 million bales. Cotton was king. It exceeded the value of all other American products combined, about 3/5 of America's economic output. But instead of reducing the need for labor, the cotton gin propelled it, as more slaves were needed to plant and harvest king cotton. The cotton gin and the demand of northern and English factories recharted the course of American slavery. In 1790, America's first official census counted nearly 700,000 slaves. By 1810, 2 years after the slave trade was banned in America, the number had shot up to more than 1 million. During the next 50 years, that number exploded to nearly 4 million slaves in 1860, the eve of the Civil War.
You know, back in the 40s and 50s, the original standard television had a 4:3 width to height ratio. That shape was chosen to be a slight rectangle, but still mostly square, thus having the maximal screen area for the given dimensions. And that's still the ratio on many TVs and computer monitors in today's homes. The problem is, hardly anybody today creates video content in a 4:3 ratio. See, this whole problem started when people wanted to watch movies from the theater in the comfort of their own homes. Movie screens are considerably larger than our home television. But more important, the screen is a completely different rectangle and can't mathematically fit on our TV screens without manipulation. A typical TV is 1 1/3 times wider than it is tall. Some movie screens could be up to 3 times as wide as it is tall. So what are we going to do to make it fit? Well, we have all kinds of options. Or we could squeeze and stretch and mangle everything onto the screen to make it all fill up, and everyone would look ridiculously thin and compressed. The good news is, the sound would be just fine. Although I don't think people would be too happy about that option, particularly the actors in the movie. We could just cut a chunk of the original movie like a cookie cutter and just see that frame of the movie. Problem with that would people and objects be speaking from off the screen, or even worse, it might be cut in half. Some movie editors use what's called the pan and scan technique to allow the full height of the TV screen to be used, but pick and choose what section of the original movie should be shown on your screen, thus eliminating the annoying cutting of people.
How, as a journalist, do you ask the questions that yield this type of narrative? You have to know what to ask of whom. First, you need to understand that every piece of journalism requires a trifecta of sourcing. If you picture the reporting process as depicted by a triangle, one side will be official sources, another side will be overview sources, and a third side will be unofficial sources. All three components are necessary in every well-reported piece. The first side has official sources. Those are the people with titles and expertise who own the company, are spokespeople for the movement. They tell you the numbers and the answers to how much, how many, where, when, and who. A second side of the triangle includes overview sources. Academics, consultants, authors, who are not directly connected as stakeholders but have knowledge of the big picture. Yet it is the third side of the trifecta, unofficial sources, who hold the power of the individual's insight. This is where you can find the why, giving consequence on the event, trend, phase, or idea, and what it means on a soul level to someone affected by it. So how do you mine for the gems, identifying what is compelling from what is chatter? You ask surprising questions. To achieve the complicated, fragile human connection, you regard the stories of every subject as sacred. Realize that an anecdote is oxygen that breathes life into a gray story of exposition, facts, and data.
And systemic errors don't just appear in matters of human judgment. From 1993 to 2008, the same female DNA was found in multiple crime scenes around Europe, incriminating an elusive killer dubbed the Phantom of Heilbronn. But the DNA evidence was so consistent precisely because it was wrong. It turned out that the cotton swabs used to collect the DNA samples had all been accidentally contaminated by a woman working in the swab factory. In other cases, systematic errors arise through deliberate fraud, like the presidential referendum held by Saddam Hussein in 2002, which claimed a turnout of 100% of voters, with all 100% supposedly voting in favor of another 7-year term. When you look at it this way, the paradox of unanimity isn't actually all that paradoxical. Unanimous agreement is still theoretically ideal, especially in cases when you'd expect very low odds of variability and uncertainty. But in practice, achieving it in situations where perfect agreement is highly unlikely should tell us that there's probably some hidden factor affecting the system. Although we may strive for harmony and consensus, in many situations, error and disagreement should be naturally expected. And if a perfect result seems too good to be true, it probably is. And though it may sound surprising, the best way to stay protected before, during, and after a nuclear detonation is getting inside. Similar to protecting yourself from tornadoes or hurricanes, getting and staying inside a sturdy building would offer protection from the explosion's shock. The shock wave of energy would travel several kilometers beyond the fireball's radius in the first few seconds. Sturdy buildings within that range should be able to withstand the shock wave, and staying in the centers and basements of these buildings also helps provide protection from heat and flying objects. Finding shelter is especially important if the fireball occurs close to the Earth, as it will pull thousands of tons of dirt and debris several kilometers into the atmosphere. As the fireball cools, unstable atoms created by the nuclear fission mix with the debris to produce the most dangerous long-term effect of a nuclear detonation, radioactive particles called fallout. These sand-sized particles emit ionizing radiation, capable of separating electrons from molecules and atoms. Exposure to massive amounts of this radiation can result in cell damage, radiation burns, radiation sickness, cancer, and even death. Thankfully, the same buildings that offer protection from the blast are even better at guarding against fallout. Radiation is reduced as it travels through space and mass. So while a broken window and sealed window both have the same minimal effect on radiation, thick layers of steel, concrete, and packed earth can offer serious protection.
Today, the US power grid is the world's largest machine. It contains more than 7,300 electricity-generating plants, linked by some 11 million kilometers of power lines, transformers, and substations. Power grids span Earth's continents, transmitting electricity around the clock. They're massive feats of engineering, but their functioning depends on a delicate balance. Their components must always work in unison, maintain a constant frequency throughout the grid, and match energy supply with demand. If there's too much electricity in the system, you get unsafe power spikes that can overheat and damage equipment. Too little electricity, and you get blackouts. So, to strike this balance, power grid operators monitor the grid from sophisticated control centers. They forecast energy demand and adjust which power plants are active, signaling them to turn their output up or down to precisely meet current demand. By considering factors like the availability and cost of energy resources, grid operators create a dispatch curve, which maps out the order in which energy sources will be used. The grid defaults to using energy from the start of the curve first. Usually the resources are ordered by price. Those at the start tend to be renewables because they have much lower production costs.
People make friends with other people when they spend casual time together. This is how our ancestors formed their relationships, because humans lived in small, close-knit communities in which options for making friends were limited, so we just formed good relationships with the people who were around us. This is why it's so easy to form new friendships in school and university. Society locks you and your peers in a building for several years. You share similar activities, but more importantly, similar schedules. Overlapping and fluctuating social circles form, naturally giving you regular FaceTime and shared experiences with many different people. Time to find others with similar worldviews or senses of humor. Proximity can be more important than similar interests. One study found that in student dormitories, the distance between rooms was the strongest friendship predictor. Living closer together meant a higher chance of becoming friends. Another study showed that being physically present in a class a lot without saying a word makes others more sympathetic to you. So the most important principle of making friends is to regularly spend time with people in the real world. This alone can make it happen automatically and trumps all other advice.
Well, today I'm going to tell you about a serious reality that is changing our oceans, called ocean acidification, or the evil twin of climate change. Did you know that the oceans have absorbed 25% of all of the carbon dioxide that we have emitted to the atmosphere? Now, this is just another great service provided by the oceans, since carbon dioxide is one of the greenhouse gases that's causing climate change. But as we keep pumping more and more and more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, more is dissolving into the oceans. And this is what's changing our ocean chemistry. When carbon dioxide dissolves in seawater, it undergoes a number of chemical reactions. Now, lucky for you, I don't have time to get into the details of the chemistry for today, but I'll tell you, as more carbon dioxide enters the ocean, the seawater pH goes down. And this basically means that there is an increase in ocean acidity. And this whole process is called ocean acidification, and it's happening alongside climate change. Scientists have been monitoring ocean acidification for over 2 decades. This figure is an important time series in Hawaii, and the top line shows a steadily increasing concentrations of carbon dioxide, or CO2 gas, in the atmosphere. And this is directly as a result of human activities. The line underneath shows the increasing concentrations of carbon dioxide that is dissolved in the surface of the ocean, which you can see is increasing at the same rate as carbon dioxide in the atmosphere since measurements began. The line on the bottom then shows the change in chemistry. As more carbon dioxide has entered the ocean, the seawater pH has gone down, which basically means there has been an increase in ocean acidity.
There are 2 major factors that cause food to go bad: microbes and oxidation. Microbes like bacteria and fungi invade food and feed off its nutrients. Some of these can cause diseases like listeria and botulism. Others just turn edibles into a smelly, slimy, moldy mess. Meanwhile, oxidation is a chemical change in the food's molecules caused by enzymes or free radicals, which turn fats rancid and brown produce like apples and potatoes. Preservatives can prevent both types of deterioration. Before the invention of artificial refrigeration, fungi and bacteria could run rampant in food. So we found ways to create an inhospitable environment for microbes. For example, making the food more acidic unravels enzymes that microbes need to survive. And some types of bacteria can actually help. For thousands of years, people preserved food using bacteria that produce lactic acid. The acid turns perishable vegetables and milk into longer-lasting foods like sauerkraut in Europe, kimchi in Korea, and yogurt in the Middle East. These cultured foods also populate your digestive tract with beneficial microbes. Many synthetic preservatives are also acids: benzoic acid in salad dressing, sorbic acid in cheese, and propionic acid in baked goods.
Most people intuitively blame it on their nerves. But why does being nervous undermine expert performance? There are 2 sets of theories, which both say that primarily choking under pressure boils down to focus. First, there are the distraction theories. These suggest that performance suffers when the mind is preoccupied with worries, doubts, or fears, instead of focusing its attention on performing the task at hand. When relevant and irrelevant thoughts compete for the same attention, something has to give. The brain can only process so much information at once. Tasks that challenge working memory, the mental scratch pad we use to temporarily store phone numbers and grocery lists, are especially vulnerable to pressure. In a 2004 study, a group of university students were asked to perform math problems, some easy, others more complex and memory-intensive. Half the students completed both problem types with nothing at stake, while the others completed them when calm and under pressure. While everyone did well on the easy problems, those who were stressed performed worse on the more difficult memory-intensive tasks. Explicit monitoring theories make up the second group of explanations for choking under pressure. They're concerned with how pressure can cause people to overanalyze the task at hand. Here, the logic goes that once a skill becomes automatic, thinking about its precise mechanics interferes with your ability to do it. Tasks we do unconsciously seem to be most vulnerable to this kind of choking.
So my optimism is rooted in the fact that for over almost 200 years, every year has gotten a little bit better when we look at the scientific evidence. And that while it's possible that next year everything could change, everything could collapse and fall to the ground, statistically, probabilistically, it won't. It will continue because 200 years is gone and next year it probably will continue. But if you look at the kind of current political regime around the world and the factors of pressures, environmental pressures, the pressures of distraction that we have from the new media, then I think you have to resort to hope. In the long term, optimists decide the future. It's the optimists who create all the things that are going to be most important in our lives, because it was the optimists who built and invented all the things that are now important in our current lives. And I think people behave better when they're optimistic. There's absolutely a need to be critical and doubtful and skeptical and even pessimistic. Just like if you have a car, you have to have brakes. You can't have a car, no matter where it is, without brakes. But it's the engine, the optimistic engine, that keeps going and refuses to stop and is only concerned about going forward, that really drives a car.
You could put a Trader Joe's or Walmart on every corner, and the food insecure could still not afford to eat or to buy what they should be eating. Why? Because America's food system is designed from the Farm Bill on up to make calories cheap and nutrition expensive. And that's why the face of hunger in America today is an obese person. Food insecure Americans are forced to fill up on food that's loaded with sugar, fat, sodium, little nutrition. Hence, the answer isn't a full stomach. It's a healthy meal. So my next learning was about money. Nonprofits tend to spend 75% of management's time in fundraising. They do great work. It's the air they breathe. But funder fatigue sets in. Funding dries up. So I wondered, instead of seeking donors to continually fund our mission year after year, would it be possible to have a mission that could fund itself? Well, we did something interesting. We actually went into a food insecure neighborhood and asked the people what they wanted. And they said, we don't want handouts. We want to buy tasty, nutritious food we can afford. We're not looking for charity. We're buying food now. We want to keep buying food. Don't make your store needs-based. Everybody should be able to shop there. We don't want to feel stigmatized by shopping in a store that's just for poor people. Another light bulb. It turns out people are even hungrier to keep their dignity than for nutrition, which means we can use the dignity problem to help solve the funding problem.
First, gases always move in a straight line. We don't really have anything to demonstrate this with because gravity always pulls objects down. So, imagine a bullet fired from a gun, and that bullet goes on at a constant speed in a perfectly straight line. That would be like a gas molecule. Second, gases are so small, they occupy no volume on their own. As a group they do. Blow up any balloon and you can see how that volume changes. But single gases have no volume compared to other forms of matter. Rather than calculating such a small amount of matter, we just call it zero for simplicity. Third, if gas molecules collide, and they do, remember these are assumptions, their energy remains constant. An easy way to demonstrate this is by dropping a soccer ball with a tennis ball balanced on top. Because the soccer ball is bigger, it has more potential energy, and the energy from the larger ball is transferred to the smaller tennis ball and it flies away when that energy is transferred. The total energy stays the same. Gases work the same way. If they collide, smaller particles will speed up, larger particles will slow down. The total energy is constant. Fourth, gases do not attract one another, and they don't like to touch. But remember Rule 3, in reality they do collide. Finally, gases have energy that is proportional to the temperature. The higher the temperature, the higher the energy the gases have. The crazy thing is that at the same temperature, all gases have the same energy. It doesn't depend on the type of gas, just the temperature that gas is at.
Of course, living on the moon won't be easy. The camp envisioned is not so much a village as an inhabited research base. similar to those in places like Antarctica. But there are far greater obstacles to living on the moon than just cold weather. The biggest is cosmic radiation. Unlike the Earth, the moon has no atmosphere and no magnetic field. A person on its surface can receive over 400 times the maximum safe dosage of heavy ion radiation, enough to be fatal within 10 hours, even in a spacesuit. The first step would likely involve robots and 3D printers constructing covered habitats from lunar soil, or building shelters inside caves formed by lava tubes from the moon's volcanic past. But what would the inhabitants live on? Supplies would need to be transported from Earth at first. Growing plants requires greenhouse soil and air rich in carbon dioxide, a gas that's rare on the moon, but could be synthesized from recycled materials. A water treatment plant could be supplied by ice mined from the polar regions, using a specialized drill that can bore 2 meters beneath the lunar surface. Friendly bacteria and viruses necessary to the human microbiome and immune system would also have to be imported or synthesized on site. And lunar inhabitants would have to exercise for hours a day to maintain bone and muscle mass. That's because the moon's gravity is just 1/6 that of the Earth. And the everyday strain of working against gravity is part of what keeps our bodies healthy. There's evidence that caffeine's effects on adenosine and dopamine receptors can have long-term benefits too, reducing the risk of diseases like Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and some types of cancer. Caffeine can also ramp up the body's ability to burn fat. In fact, some sports organizations think that caffeine gives athletes an unfair advantage and have placed limits on its consumption. From 1972 until 2004, Olympic athletes had to stay below a certain blood caffeine concentration to compete. Of course, not all of caffeine's effects are so helpful. It might make you feel better and more alert, but it can also raise your heart rate and blood pressure, cause increased urination or diarrhea, and contribute to insomnia and anxiety. Plus, the foods and beverages caffeine is found in have their own impacts on your body that have to be taken into account. Your brain can adapt to regular consumption of caffeine. If your adenosine receptors are perpetually clogged, your body will manufacture extra ones. That way, even with caffeine around, adenosine can still do its job of signaling the brain to power down. That's why you may find you need to consume more and more caffeine to feel as alert. There are more and more adenosine receptors to block.
You know, as a compounding pharmacist, I do consults, and I got into this because I really saw not just my own kids, but my own patients that were missing the food part. They were missing that nutrition part, and as I corrected nutrition in them, I'm like, oh my, this changed their whole life. You were taught in pharmacy school, just give a drug, give a drug, give a drug. Drugs are just Band-Aids. They don't cure us. If you don't have good nutrition, that foundation that we're building our body on isn't there. And so that leads to all sorts of things, you know, depression, leaky gut, you know, gum disease. People that are constantly having headaches, I mean, they're not growing properly. Our kids don't grow properly because of nutrition. So it starts with good foundation. If you have a good foundation with nutrition, eat it, what you grow, or buy it locally, you're going to be way healthier.
So crazy how your diet can affect pretty much everything.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to put into a sentence how cool and interesting I thought this whole experience was. I've always been a firm believer in what you put in your body matters and the food you put in your body matters. And we are allowing food industries to spray it with pesticides, to transport it super far, change its enzymes and nutritional benefits so that when we're receiving the food, it's not even giving us the fuel that we need to survive in a healthy way.
The body is an incredible piece of equipment, machinery. You put good stuff in, it gives good stuff out. If you put bad stuff in time, bad stuff's going to come out. But you can correct it. Mm-hmm. It just takes some effort on our part to do what's right. Who said that? Hippocrates, you are what you eat. Mm-hmm. Let food be medicine, let medicine be food. He said it a lot more eloquently, but yeah, I firmly believe that.
Big plants are steady, but they're not very flexible.
Generally, to power something, you have these huge base load gas plants.
And these are running kind of all the time, no matter what. And they're pretty slow, and you can't really adjust how much energy they're creating.
When demand is too low, these big, slow plants actually lose money. And when demand is too high, quicker, dirtier plants called peaker plants have to switch on to keep up. And they're pretty wasteful.
So you kind of get dinged on both sides. You get dinged when you don't have enough load, and then when you have too much, you also get dinged inefficiently.
So traditional plants aren't super efficient, but they're consistent and therefore predictable. Renewable energy can be another story. Solar and wind power is cheap and clean and plentiful, but only when the sun is shining or the wind is blowing.
So inconsistency is the big worry that, it'll be a cloudy day or it'll be a still day, and then all of a sudden your appliances won't work. And that's something that no one really wants.
What makes batteries so promising is that they can solve all of these problems. When paired with big power plants, they can supply energy during peak times without polluting the way that peaker plants do. And when paired with renewables, they can jump in when clouds roll over a solar farm. Energy storage really is the missing piece of the puzzle for renewable energy. But when we say storage, we don't just necessarily mean these. On a super broad level, a battery is like a bank for energy. You deposit energy into it when you don't need it, and withdraw it when you do. We use electrical energy on the grid, but we can store it as any kind of energy.
The doctor-patient relationship is a founding principle of healthcare and medicine.
The first step is to eliminate keyboards and computer screens in clinical encounters.
Some doctors in the West can spend up to twice as many hours on medical paperwork than with their patients.
In the years ahead, we should be able to eliminate the data clerk functions of clinicians. These are mutually hated as much by patients as by doctors and clinicians.
AI tools, such as speech recognition technology, that are now commonplace in homes, could be used in clinical settings for capturing data and notes, allowing doctors to concentrate on people.
We have a problem with accuracy and efficiency.
Trained on a huge resource of medical data, the power of AI learning can read some images more accurately than humans.
Whether it's a pattern like a scan or a slide or prediction, AI can really rev up the accuracy, and that is important for a better diagnosis, better treatments, better outcomes, lower cost.
Powerful machines can interpret scans 150 times faster than radiologists and can work 24 hours a day. AI can even suggest a diagnosis.
Many conditions could be AI diagnosed. And so the time that a doctor comes into play is very specific to important diagnoses.
Instead of real eye damage, you might experience some eye discomfort, like blurry vision, dry eyes, watery eyes, and tired eyes. These symptoms even have a name. It's called computer vision syndrome. I know my eyes feel heavy after a long day of staring, but a doctor isn't going to worry about my long-term health, so don't be scared by that really intense name. Still, my eyes are irritated and it's annoying. We likely experience computer vision syndrome because we blink less when we stare at a screen, according to optometrist Allison Bozung from the University of Iowa.
So our blink rate slows pretty significantly in some studies, up to about 2/3, so about 67%. Slower or less blinking.
And it's not easy to consciously blink more. I'm very aware of that. You'll probably look a little bit crazy if you try, so instead, use eye drops to keep your eyeballs moist. Make sure they are for that purpose and not for redness relief. Take breaks too. Most doctors recommend the 20-20-20 rule.
20-20-20 rule. 20-20-20 rule.
Which says that for every 20 minutes that you're on a computer or staring at a screen, take 20 seconds to stare at something 20 feet away.
It requires more energy to focus at a near target than it does to focus at a distance target.
Why do we get used to everyday things? Well, as human beings, we have limited brain power. And so our brains encode the everyday things we do into habits. So we can free up space to learn new things. It's a process called habituation. And it's one of the most basic ways as humans we learn. Now, habituation isn't always bad. Remember learning to drive? I sure do. Your hands clenched at 10 and 2 on the wheel. Looking at every single object out there, the cars, the lights, the pedestrians. is a nerve-wracking experience. So much so that I couldn't even talk to anyone else in the car, and I couldn't even listen to music. But then something interesting happened. As the weeks went by, driving became easier and easier. You habituated it. It started to become fun and second nature. And then you could talk to your friends again and listen to music. So there's a good reason why our brains habituate things. If we didn't, we'd notice every little detail all the time. It would be exhausting, and we'd have no time to learn about new things. But sometimes habituation isn't good. If it stops us from noticing the problems that are around us, well, that's bad. And if it stops us from noticing and fixing those problems, well, then that's really bad.
Today, I have come to share the secrets of our success because rich capitalists like me have never been richer. So the question is, how do we do it? How do we manage to grab an ever-increasing share of the economic pie every year? Is it that rich people are smarter than we were 30 years ago? Is it that we're working harder than we once did? Are we taller? Better looking? Sadly, no. It all comes down to just one thing: economics. Because here's the dirty secret. There was a time in which the economics profession worked in the public interest for everyone, but in the neoliberal era, today, they work only for big corporations and billionaires. And that is creating a little bit of a problem. We could choose to enact economic policies that raise taxes on the rich, regulate powerful corporations, or raise wages for workers. We have done it before. But neoliberal economists would warn that all of these policies would be a terrible mistake because raising taxes always kills economic growth. And any form of government regulation is inefficient, and raising wages always kills jobs.
All organisms on Earth are made from the same basic parts, mostly proteins. Proteins are the building blocks of life and can have billions of different shapes. You can imagine them as 3D puzzle pieces. There are billions of different puzzle pieces your enemies can use to construct their bodies. Why is this important? Because proteins are, in a way, the language of the micro-world. Cells don't have eyes or ears, so to tell friend from foe, they have to touch them and recognize if their protein is part of a friend or part of an enemy. Recognizing means that cells have countless tiny devices called receptors that are able to connect with a specific protein puzzle piece. So your cells have tiny puzzle pieces on their outsides that are able to click together or recognize other protein puzzle pieces. When a cell connects together with a protein and recognizes it as enemy, it knows that it has to attack. Only if your cells can make this distinction between friend or foe is your immune system able to fight an invader. But since there are billions of possible protein puzzle pieces, this means there are billions of possible enemy puzzle pieces. This is also one of the reasons we still have to deal with diseases like the flu each year. The influenza virus mutates very rapidly, and so the proteins that make up its hull constantly change a tiny bit. The soldiers of your innate immune system have a large number of the puzzle pieces for common bacteria and viruses memorized. That's why they are your all-purpose weapons.
So in the process, I learned all of these incredibly wonderful theories that the smartest people who have ever lived have developed over the last 2,500 years that help us make better decisions and become better people. For example, I learned about Immanuel Kant and the categorical imperative. So Kant says when we're about to do something, we have to design a rule or a maxim that we could will to be universal, meaning we have to imagine what if everyone did what we're about to do. What would happen to the world? Would it be okay, or would it get all screwed up? So the maxim I'm designing here is something like, anytime two people are in any kind of negotiation, one of them can drag into the negotiation an entirely unrelated global calamity and tell the other person that they shouldn't care about whatever they care about because they should care about that instead. That world would suck, right? Like, your sister borrows $5 from you, you ask for it back. She says, how dare you care about $5 when the polar ice caps are melting? No one wants to live in this world, right? Kant also says, by the way, that you should treat people as ends in themselves and not a means to an end, meaning you shouldn't use people to get what you want. Well, guess what I was doing?
Animals have been used in research aimed at improving human welfare for centuries, typically at the cost of their lives. This practice reflects the widespread belief that human lives are more valuable than non-human lives. People have different views about the ethics of animal testing and how it's conducted. But whatever your opinion, this scenario raises an important philosophical question. How do we determine the value of a life, whether human or non-human? One tool philosophers have used to consider this question is moral status. Beings with moral status should have their needs and interests taken into consideration by those making decisions that impact them. Traditionally, moral status has been seen as binary. Either a being's interests matter for their own sake, or they don't. And historically, many philosophers believed that humans had moral status and other animals didn't. Some contemporary philosophers, like Shelley Kagan, have argued that moral status comes in degrees. But even in this model, he argues that people have the most moral status. However, determining what grants any degree of moral status can be difficult. Enlightenment philosopher Immanuel Kant thought humans have moral status because of their rational nature and ability to will their actions. A binary conception of moral status then suggests that beings with these capacities are persons, bearing full moral status, while all other creatures are things without moral status. But thinkers like Christine Korsgaard have argued a Kantian view should include many non-human animals because of how they value their own good.
Around 30% of our planet is covered in trees. Trees are majestic, help biodiversity, and can reduce climate change, but we're cutting them down at an alarming rate. Since the start of human civilization, it's estimated that we've cut down almost half the trees on Earth. So, what would happen if all of us, and that's all 7.7 billion of us, planted a tree? Well, there might be 7.7 billion of us, but it's estimated there are currently over 3 trillion trees on the planet. 7.7 billion more trees would be a valuable step forward, but we need to go further to make a really substantial difference to the environment. But we could. In fact, according to one estimate, if we planted 1.2 trillion trees, we'd cancel out a decade's worth of CO2 emissions by the time the forests mature. So that's more like 160 trees per person. Trees take carbon dioxide out of the air and release oxygen, making them a natural source of carbon capture. Planting 1.2 trillion more trees could capture up to 100 gigatons of CO2, on top of the 400 gigatons captured by all our existing trees. Trees planted near the equator can be especially beneficial as they grow much faster in the warm, wet and humid environment. Let's imagine that happened. In as little as 20 or 30 years, entire woodlands and forests would be established. And in 100 years, these trees would grow and mature, safeguarding habitats that otherwise get cut down. We'd also see a rise in biodiversity as trees get older and start to decompose, because they, along with dead trees, offer a habitat to all kinds of fungi and insects. On top of this, we could see a positive impact to our mental health, as studies have shown trees can lower stress and make people happier.
One thing that is nuclear to defeating procrastination once and for all, and which is actually a common denominator to any technique, system, or habit you can start implementing, is momentum. The idea is very simple. Any task or project becomes easier once you start working on it. Okay, so think about this. You may notice that when you have a pretty lazy day, it feels even more difficult to do things. So if you didn't do anything in the morning, you may find that it may be actually difficult to do some basic tasks like cleaning the dishes or going outside for a walk with your dog. On the other hand, when you're having a very productive day, it feels like you're on a roll as you go through these tasks and you accomplish those tasks, tick off those items in your to-do list. It seems like getting things done is actually easier than you realized before. And this is a basic example of what momentum does for you. It has a lot to do with your confidence in your own work and energy, as well as your ability to trust yourself to actually get things done. And for a lot of people, working on the same type of tasks all the time, while using the same tools, mindset, and resources for several hours is one of the things that contribute a lot to procrastination, and it also contributes to that feeling of lack of progress that is really unhelpful when trying to boost your confidence in your work and momentum in general. So diversifying the type of tasks, the resources you need, as well as the level of challenge can be a really positive way for you to diversify the items in your to-do list and gain that momentum back.
I think light mode is far better with respect to being able to comfortably read and use a digital device for a long period of time. And I think there are enough studies to back that up.
And there are indeed a bunch of studies to back this up. The consensus is that our eyes are roughly 26% worse at reading when it comes to dark mode.
The biggest scientific factors for this are focus, light scatter, and contrast. Let's use a camera lens to explain the first one.
Focusing is largely affected by how much light is coming into our eyes and how we focus that light. If a lot of light is coming in, like when using light modes, our pupils contract, allowing less light in, creating a wide depth of field, meaning everything is in focus. If this is inverted, less light coming in, that causes our pupils to dilate, and that creates a shallower plane of focus, meaning our eyes have to put more effort into focusing on individual objects. When it comes to reading, you want everything to be in focus.
You need that light background for the pupil to work appropriately to minimize the amount of light coming in. It also increases your depth of focus. The eye just works better, more comfortably.
But what's actually going on during that process? Well, firstly, drowning isn't like how you see it in the movies. There's not a lot of thrashing around or yells for help. Typically, it's a silent act, where the person's mouth sinks below the surface of the water and then reappears as they try to breathe. Once they can no longer hold their initial breath and start to hyperventilate, they might aspirate water, triggering something called a laryngospasm. This is where the person's vocal cords spasm, blocking their airways and protecting their lungs. However, it also inconveniently makes yelling for help significantly harder to do. Since the person can't take in any fresh air, their oxygen supply starts to fall, potentially leading to a condition called hypoxia. This is where there's not enough oxygen reaching the body's tissues, and eventually, as the person becomes unconscious, there's a relaxation of their airway, allowing their lungs to fill with water. Depending on how long the person has gone without air, varying levels of damage can occur. For example, a 2013 study found that the likelihood of surviving with little to no brain damage was very low after being submerged for 10 minutes or more. The lack of oxygen can also lead to cardiac arrest. So basically what I'm saying is that drowning is absolutely terrifying, so please wear your life jackets, kids. They're cool and they'll keep you safe.
I think a good learning environment has to have, I think, the tenet that brave failure is preferable to timid success. By which I mean, I think our minds are great and powerful things. And I think that to have courage inform our thinking, and to be able to go out perhaps past where we may be comfortable, to go into the unknown between human beings and see where that takes us, to not stay safe in our own position, but to make it safe for other people to be able to share. I think that that's where we get to new ideas. I think that's where we get to brave ideas. I think that's where we get to solutions that we might not otherwise have found. So fostering an environment where people can be brave and where ideas don't always have to be pristine, I think is very important.
Is there an external reality? Of course there's an external reality. The world exists, it's just that we don't see it. At least we don't see it as it is. In fact, we can never see it as it is. In fact, it's even useful to not see it as it is. And the reason is because it goes back to really Berkeley, who tells us we have no direct access to that physical world other than through our senses. And because our senses conflate multiple aspects of that world, we can never know whether our perceptions are in any way accurate. And so this has always been a very deep question. It's not so much do we see the world in the way that it really is, but do we actually even see it accurately? And the answer is no, we don't. So if we remember that the information that's coming onto your eye or onto your skin or into your ears is inherently meaningless because it could mean anything, then it means that we need another kind of data in order to be able to generate behaviors that are useful. and that data is necessarily historical, which means that the functional structure of your brain is really a physical manifestation of your past interactions with the world. And it's a physical active interaction. It's not a passive receiving data like a Facebook broadcast. It's an active engagement with that world.
Suicide is one of the leading causes of death in our country and actually in the world, and yet it's largely preventable. It has been trending up in terms of our national rate of suicide over the last decade or so. It had trended down prior to that. So we're at a place now where we really want to make a difference. We want to use the methods that we know can work to lower the suicide rate and allow those who are struggling to get the help that they need. Mental health problems play a significant role for suicide risk. In fact, if you had to pick out one of the many risk factors that tend to come together to create suicide, mental health problems could be called actually a necessary but not sufficient factor in place. In greater than 90% of cases of suicide, as shown in the research, there is a diagnosable mental health condition at play, whether or not it was diagnosed or treated. Now, many other factors then lay on top of that to rise up to create an imminent risk for that sense of desperation, hopelessness, but then also the thought, the planning, and the ability to act on those suicidal impulses.
The summer learning loss is a term that they use to describe the regressions that kids in low-income neighborhoods face relative to their affluent peers. So they say in lower-income neighborhoods, kids forget anywhere from 2.5 to 3.5 months of what they learned during the school year over the summer, while their middle-class peers break even or even make gains. When I first learned about the achievement gap, I was a freshman in college, and I sort of wanted to understand what the causes of it were. And as I started to do my research, I realized that there were 1,000 different reasons for why the achievement gap existed. Everything from a lack of positive role models to poor health conditions in so many of these inner city and low-income neighborhoods. And then I found this startling statistic that said that 2/3 of the achievement gap could be directly attributed to unequal summer learning opportunities, or the summer learning loss. In low-income neighborhoods, kids forget anywhere from 2.5 to 3.5 months of what they learn over the summer from the school year. And so when they return to school, they're now 2.5 to 3.5 months behind their affluent or their middle-class peers. Just to put that in perspective for you all, the school year from September to June is only 10 months long. If a kid forgets 2.5 to 3.5 months of what they learned, that's almost 25 to 35% of their learning. Teachers have then reported that they spend anywhere from 1.5 to 2 months reteaching old material. So if you add that additional 20%, you're talking about 50% of a kid's learning. So we sit here and we ask ourselves, why does this 8th grader only have a 4th grade reading level? And the truth of the matter is that, theoretically speaking, they've only been in school for half the time.
In 2012, I traveled to Colombia to prepare for the first ever prevention study in Alzheimer's disease. A simple blood test could detect the mutation. If the study is successful, patients could be identified and treated before the onset of symptoms. But what about the rest of the world with Alzheimer's disease due to different genetic and environmental risks? What about patients like my friend David? Today's technologies, smartphones, wearables, online patient communities, and online assessment tools can be used to gather data in an unprecedented global scale. With enough data, we can begin to understand the emerging genetics and this disease, much the way Dr. Lopera did in Colombia. When that happens, we can begin to understand your risk for Alzheimer's disease, the biologic pathways that are most important in you, and most importantly, when to begin treatment. Now is the time that patients, family members, physicians, scientists, and drug developers all have a role to play in defeating Alzheimer's disease.
Now let me first show you how the unity is shown in chimpanzees. What you see here is 2 males on the left who are standing together. You also see the big canine teeth that they have. And they're standing together and they demonstrate to the rest of the group, we are together. We are a unit. The males on the right are walking together in synchrony. That's another way of demonstrating that you are together. And so demonstrating unity is extremely important in a coalition system. And as I said, in the primaries, always I'm waiting for that moment, because then you have two members of the same party who have been fighting with each other, and they need to come together at some moment. And it leads to very awkward situations. People who don't like each other need to embrace each other and stand together. And that's absolutely essential for the unity of the party. And if you don't do that, the party may fall apart. And so if it doesn't go well, like in this particular case, then the party is in deep doo-doo, because they have not demonstrated unity.
So we had the idea, can we take some of these NASA-type ideas and apply them to our carbon problem here on Earth? Could we cultivate these NASA-type microbes in order to make valuable products here on Earth? And we started a company to do it. And in that company, we actually discovered that these hydrogenotrophs, which I will actually call nature's supercharged carbon recyclers, we found that they are a powerful class of microbes that had been largely overlooked and understudied, and that they could make some really valuable products. And so we began cultivating these products, these microbes in our lab. We found that we can make essential amino acids from carbon dioxide using these microbes. And we even made a protein-rich meal that has an amino acid profile that's similar to what you might find in some animal proteins. And we began cultivating them even further, and we found that we could make oil. And oils are used to manufacture many products. We made an oil that was similar to a citrus oil, which can be used for flavoring and for fragrances, but it also can be used as a biodegradable cleaner or even as a jet fuel. And we made an oil that's similar to palm oil. And palm oil is used to manufacture a wide range of consumer and industrial goods.
Back in the 1970s, our first king famously pronounced that for Bhutan, gross national happiness is more important than gross national product. Ever since, all development in Bhutan is driven by G&H, a pioneering vision that aims to improve the happiness and well-being of our people. But that's easier said than done, especially when you're one of the smallest economies in the world. Our entire GDP is less than $2 billion. I know that some of you here are worth more individually than the entire economy of my country. So our economy is small. But here's where it gets interesting. Education is completely free. All citizens are guaranteed free school education, and those that work hard are given free college education. Healthcare is also completely free. Medical consultation, medical treatment, medicines, they're all provided by the state. We manage this because we use our limited resources very carefully, and because we stay faithful to the core mission of G&H, which is development with values. Our economy is small, and we must strengthen it. Economic growth is important, but that economic growth must not come from undermining our unique culture or our pristine environment.
But actually, it turns out there's a twist here, because givers are often sacrificing themselves, but they make their organizations better. We have a huge body of evidence, many studies, looking at the frequency of giving behavior that exists in a team or an organization. And the more often people are helping and sharing their knowledge and providing mentoring, the better organizations do on every metric we can measure. Higher profits, customer satisfaction, employee retention, even lower operating expenses. So givers spend a lot of time trying to help other people and improve the team, and then unfortunately they suffer along the way. And I want to talk about what it takes to build cultures where givers actually get to succeed. So I wondered then, if givers are the worst performers, who are the best performers? And let me start with the good news. It's not the takers. Takers tend to rise quickly but also fall quickly in most jobs. And they fall at the hands of matchers. If you're a matcher, you believe in an eye for an eye, a just world.
And so when you meet a taker, you feel like it's your mission in life to just punish the hell out of that person. And that way justice gets served. Well, most people are matchers, and that means if you're a taker, it tends to catch up with you eventually. What goes around will come around. And so the logical conclusion is it must be the matchers who are the best performers. But they're not. In every job, in every organization I've ever studied, the best results belong to the givers again.
Evidence shows that a simple view of nature can radically improve health outcomes. So why couldn't we design a hospital where every patient had a window with a view? Simple, site-specific designs can make a hospital that heals. Designing it is one thing, getting it built, we learned, is quite another. We worked with Bruce Nizet, a brilliant engineer, and he thought about construction differently than I had been taught in school. When we had to excavate this enormous hilltop, and a bulldozer was expensive and hard to get to site, Bruce suggested doing it by hand, using a method in Rwanda called ubudehe, which means community works for the community. Hundreds of people came with shovels and hoes, and we excavated that hill in half the time and half the cost of that bulldozer. Instead of importing furniture, Bruce started a guild, and he brought in master carpenters to train others on how to make furniture by hand. And on this job site, 15 years after the Rwandan genocide, Bruce insisted that we bring on labor from all backgrounds and that half of them be women. Bruce was using the process of building to heal, not just for those who were sick, but for the entire community as a whole. We call this the locally fabricated way of building, or LoFab, and it has 4 pillars. Hire locally, source regionally, train where you can, and most importantly, think about every design decision as an opportunity to invest in the dignity of the places and where you serve. Think of it like the local food movement, but for architecture. And we're convinced that this way of building can be replicated across the world and change the way that we talk about and evaluate architecture.
So the first thing to notice is that while the mechanical clocks that we make, even your quartz watch, can tell time across a vast range of scales from tens of milliseconds to hours, minutes, and days and months and years. So the brain has many different clocks in order to tell the milliseconds and seconds and to tell the time of day. So one way to think about it is the circadian clock, the clock that tells you what time of day it is and when to arise and when to go to sleep. That doesn't have a minute hand, much less a second hand. In contrast, the clock that tells you, the timing device in your brain that tells you, this red light's taking a bit too long to turn, this traffic light's taking a bit long to turn, or I think the waiter forgot my coffee. That clock doesn't have an hour hand, much less a number of days that have gone by. So the brain has different areas, different mechanisms in order to tell time. We don't fully understand how the brain tells you what the tempo of a song is or when the red light is going to change. But it doesn't seem to have to do with any oscillator counter mechanism. It seems to do with neural dynamics, which is the fact that patterns of neurons are coupled to each other, neurons are connected to each other, and when you activate some neurons, that group of neurons can activate another group of neurons, which can activate another group of neurons, so you can have these evolving patterns of neural activity.
So what can we do to become better listeners? At its core, listening in a one-on-one conversation is about taking an interest in another person and making them feel understood. There's no universally agreed upon definition of high-quality listening, but some recurring features include attentiveness, conveying understanding, and showing a positive intention towards the speaker. This doesn't mean you can simply go through the motions. Researchers have found that merely smiling and nodding at set intervals doesn't quite work. However, there is something slightly performative about listening, in that it's important to show you're doing it. So in addition to actively attending to a speaker's words, good listeners also use questions and body language that indicate their understanding and their desire to understand. This might feel awkward at first, and what's most effective might depend on your relationship with the speaker. But with time and practice, you can internalize these basic behaviors.
In 1997, a French woman named Jean Calment passed away after 122 years and 164 days on this earth, making her the oldest known person in history. Her age was so astounding that a millionaire pledged $1 million to anyone who could break her record. But in reality, living to this age or beyond is a feat that very few, maybe even no humans, are likely to accomplish. Human bodies just aren't built for extreme aging. Our capacity is set at about 90 years. But what does aging really mean, and how does it counteract the body's efforts to stay alive? We know intuitively what it means to age. For some, it means growing up, while for others, it's growing old. Yet finding a strict scientific definition of aging is a challenge. What we can say is that aging occurs when intrinsic processes and interactions with the environment, like sunlight and toxins in the air, water, and our diets, cause changes in the structure and function of the body's molecules and cells. Those changes in turn drive their decline and subsequently the failure of the whole organism. The exact mechanisms of aging are poorly understood, but recently scientists have identified 9 physiological traits, ranging from genetic changes to alterations in a cell's regenerative ability, that play a central role.
One of the most important principles of Einstein's general relativity is the equivalence principle. It says that all objects, regardless of their mass and composition, would accelerate in the same manner in the same gravitational field when no external forces act upon them. Confused? Let me put it in simple words. Suppose you simultaneously drop a feather and a stone towards the ground from the same height in a perfectly resistance-less environment. Which one, according to you, will touch the ground first? One may think that as a stone is more massive than a fragile feather, it should experience more gravitational force and hit the ground first. But that's not the case, because as per the principle of equivalence, both objects should fall simultaneously on the ground. In other words, one can say that the inertial and gravitational mass of a body is proportional to each other, which makes the acceleration independent of the physical nature of the body. Now, what is the difference between inertial mass and gravitational mass? The mass that appears in Newton's second law of motion is termed inertial mass. It simply describes how difficult it is to accelerate an object. On the other hand, the mass that appears in Newton's universal law of gravitation is the gravitational mass. It depicts the strength with which gravity acts on a body. So although a stone has more gravitational mass than a feather, the force of gravity acting on it is greater. At the same time, its inertial mass is also greater, which makes it difficult to accelerate. So the two effects cancel out, and it falls with the same acceleration as that of the feather, which is precisely the value of acceleration due to gravity in free fall. No matter how small, if there's any violation in the proportionality between inertial and gravitational mass, Einstein's entire system breaks down.
Glaucon breaks all good things into 3 classes. The first kinds we desire for their own sake, like the experience of harmless pleasure. The second we want only for the value they bring, though they may be onerous, like exercise or medicine. The third class comprises things we desire for their own sake and the value they offer, like knowledge and health. Glaucon argues that justice belongs to the second class of good. It's a burden that nevertheless brings rewards. The only reason anyone conducts themselves virtuously, he reasons, is due to external influences. So it's appearing, not actually being, virtuous that matters. Socrates, as written by Plato, disagrees, countering that justice belongs to the third class of good, offering both extrinsic and intrinsic benefits. Socrates argues that the human soul has 3 parts: reason, spirit, and appetite. Reason guides an individual to truth and knowledge and is influenced by either spirit or appetite. Spirit is righteous, ambitious, and the source of bold action, while appetite consists of baser, bodily desires. To Socrates, the philosopher is led by reason, and their spirit keeps their appetite in check, making them the most just and the happiest. Even without consequences for self-serving wrongdoings, they wouldn't commit them. Meanwhile, the tyrant succumbs to appetite and acts unjustly.
A lot of people can't get used to the short days or longer nights during the winter months. There's a lot of theories as to why that occurs. One of the theories is that we became desynchronized with the light-dark patterns because we don't get enough light during the day. So some people can't really adapt to that. So they start having feelings like depression, withdrawal, carbohydrate craving, weight gain. And that typically goes away during the summer months. So that's really what characterizes what we call seasonal affective disorder, known as winter blues.
I think there are huge individual differences. But we know of studies where it appears that maybe 20 minutes of daily dosage of strong light is enough. And then we're talking about a light that resembles daylight or an outdoor exposure. And this light dosage should be presented during morning hours.
There's a couple of things that can be done. Well, first of all, obviously go outdoors during the day. If you can, spend 1 to 2 hours outside. If you can't do that, sit by a window. But don't sit against the window. Sit facing the window because that's where you want to get the light. You wanted the light at the eye. And the third option is increase the amount of light that you have around you. So if you're going to sit at a desk and work from home, add table lamps, add lamps around your computer screen, add something that would increase that amount of light at the eye.
Radiation is a word that makes people very nervous, but to radiate just means giving off. Like when the radiator in your house gives off heat in the form of infrared radiation. Different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum correspond to different types of radiation, and many of them are perfectly harmless. Some of them can be dangerous though. Radiation with very short wavelengths, like UV light, X-rays and gamma rays, are strong enough to rip electrons out of their atoms, which can cause burns and genetic damage. This is what many people have in mind when they hear the term radiation. The rest of the spectrum covers a large range of longer waves, from visible light, infrared, microwaves to radio waves. This is the kind of radiation that's emitted by all sorts of human technology, mobile phones, Wi-Fi routers, electric power lines, and household appliances. This radiation doesn't disrupt molecules in our body. However, some kinds of radiation can stimulate muscles and nerves and can also make the hair on your body vibrate, which can sometimes cause a tingly feeling above certain threshold values. Other kinds are useful for making dinner. Microwaves push the water molecules in your food around, which warms it up. This happens to us all the time. For example, the pleasant warmth you feel at the beach is your skin heating up from exposure to electromagnetic infrared radiation from the sun. We are surrounded by natural and generally harmless sources of electromagnetic radiation all the time, and always have been.
We know that more than half of Americans are married or are living with or dating their future partner by 30. We know that the brain caps off its second and last growth spurt in your 20s as it rewires itself for adulthood, which means that whatever it is you want to change about yourself, now is the time to change it. We know that personality changes more during your 20s than at any other time in life, and we know that female fertility peaks at age 28, and things get tricky after age 35. So your 20s are the time to educate yourself about your body and your options. So when we think about child development, we all know that the first 5 years are a critical period for language and attachment in the brain. It's a time when your ordinary day-to-day life has an inordinate impact on who you will become. But what we hear less about is that there's such a thing as adult development, and our 20s are that critical period of adult development. But this isn't what 20-somethings are hearing. Newspapers talk about the changing timetable of adulthood. Researchers call the 20s an extended adolescence. Journalists coined silly nicknames for 20-somethings like twixters and cadults. It's true. As a culture, we have trivialized what is actually the defining decade of adulthood.
So target of blame seems to be why these folks can become so difficult. If you're the target of blame, your life may be ruined by one of these folks. And that's what people need to become aware of. So the target of blame, each of these 5 high conflict personalities tends to zero in generally on one person. It could change over time, but they see that person as the cause of all their problems. And so they want to control that person or eliminate that person or destroy or humiliate that person. It's a fixation on one person, and all of their life problems, they emotionally focus on that person. So you don't want to be one of those folks. How to avoid being a target of blame? First of all, if you see warning signs of this behavior, don't get too close to such a person. You may be a friend, but don't be the closest friend. You may be a coworker, but don't be the closest coworker. Because what seems to happen is the people they get really close to are the ones that are most at risk of becoming their targets of blame. But it could be anybody. They tend to target intimate others and people in authority. So this could be boyfriends, girlfriends, husbands, wives, parents, children, co-workers, neighbors they get close to. It also could be police, could be government agency or a government official, could be their boss, could be the company owner. So they tend to focus on intimate others and or people in authority.
We've been taught that once we start something, we have to finish it. And I think that so often we view books as this linear thing, whereas I think a different view of books is, what information do I need out of this book right now? Is that an entertainment read? Do I need to read from start to finish? Is it a read where I'm comparing different views on a similar problem, especially across nonfiction, right? Am I comparing and contrasting 2 or 3 different authors' argumentation or authors' views on a particular angle to a subject? In which case, I might not need to read the whole book. I just need to read a chapter. But then I've gotten everything out of that book. But books are there to serve you, right? You own the book. The book is your property. It's your mental property. It's your physical property. And you can do with it what you want. And you don't have to feel bad about putting down a book. It's the author's job to pull you into the book. It's your job to extract what you need out of the book. And I think that extracting what you need, you can just read the table of contents, read the introduction, maybe read the conclusion, skim a little bit.
Probably the most interesting fact about human development is the frontal cortex is the last part of the brain to fully mature. It is not completely online until you're about 25 years old, which is mind-boggling to think about. What does that explain? That explains why adolescents are adolescent in their behavior. The sensation-seeking and the risk-taking and the highs are higher and the lows are lower because the steadying frontal cortical hand there isn't fully up to speed yet, and everything else is a gyroscope out of control. And that's where the impulsivity is from. And that's where the extremes of behavior. And that's why most crime is committed by people at a stage whose frontal cortex is not fully developed yet. That is why most people who do astonishing, wondrously self-sacrificial things don't have a frontal cortex that's fully in gear yet either, and is not in a position to convince them yet, somebody else's problem, look the other way. That's why young adults are exactly how they are, because the frontal cortex isn't quite there yet. And what you have as a result is more adventurousness and more open to novelty and more likelihood of seeing somebody who is very different as in fact not to being that different after all, and more likely to grab a cudgel and smash in somebody's skull who happens to seem like a them, and everything, just the tone of everything is pushed up. One incredibly important implication of that is if the frontal cortex is the last part of the brain to fully mature, it means it's the part of the brain that is most sculpted by environment and experience and least constrained by genes. And it's the most interesting part of the brain.
For too long, discussions about climate change has been about sacrifice. I am here to tell you that climate solutions actually makes better city and a better quality of life for everyone. This is only the first of 5 lessons we have learned on our journey to become an emission-free city. And I think this lesson can be applied almost anywhere. So I like to share them. So, lesson number 1, Confronting climate change is about creating better cities and better quality of life for everyone, including those kids in the kindergarten that don't have to share their days with noisy excavators. The second lesson is about being ambitious. In 2015, the City Council set a target of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 95% by 2030, without purchasing any carbon offsets, so aiming for real reductions. Commitment to this goal changed our mindset. If we were going to reach this target, every department had to get active, figure out measures, and finding out how to implement them. So second lesson, be ambitious. A target measured in years, not decades, provides no excuse for inaction.
As an individual caught selling a large quantity of drugs in my late teens, I knew firsthand the power of opportunity as opposed to the wrath of the criminal justice system. Along the way, with the help of and guidance of my district attorney, my supervisor, and judges, I learned the power of the prosecutor to change lives instead of ruining them. And that's how we do it in Boston. We helped a woman who was arrested for stealing groceries to feed her kids get a job. Instead of putting an abused teenager in adult jail for punching another teenager, we secured mental health treatment and community supervision. A runaway girl who was arrested for prostituting to survive on the streets needed a safe place to live and grow, something we could help her with. I even helped a young man who was so afraid of the older gang kids showing up after school that one morning, instead of a lunchbox into his backpack, he put a loaded 9mm. We would spend our time that we would normally take prepping our cases for months and months for trial down the road by coming up with real solutions to the problems as they presented. Which is the better way to spend our time? How would you prefer your prosecutors to spend theirs? Why are we spending $80 billion on a prison industry that we know is failing when we could take that money and reallocate it into education, into mental health treatment, into substance abuse treatment, into community investment so we can develop our neighborhoods?
I'm a researcher at the MIT Media Lab, part of the Opera of the Future group. And my research focuses on the relationship people have with their own voice and with the voices of others. I study what we can learn from listening to voices from the various fields, from neurology to biology, cognitive sciences, linguistic. And in our group, we create tools and experiences to help people gain a better applied understanding of their voice in order to reduce their biases, to become better listeners, to create more healthy relationships, or just to understand themselves better. And this really has to come with a holistic approach on the voice. Because think about all the applications and implications that the voice might have as we discover more about it. Your voice is a very complex phenomenon. It requires a synchronization of more than 100 muscles in your body. And by listening to the voice, we can understand possible failures of what happens inside. For example, listening to very specific type of turbulences and non-linearity of the voice can help predict very early stages of Parkinson, just through a phone call. Listening to the breathiness of the voice can help detect heart disease. And we also know that the changes of tempo inside individual words is a very good marker of depression.
After many iterations working with experts, medical health professionals, and the women themselves, I should say it was not an easy process at all. But we had a simple and beautiful design. For $1 more than what the existing product was offered for, at $3, we were able to deliver Janma a clean birth kit in a purse. Janma meaning birth contained a blood-absorbing sheet for the woman to give birth on, a surgical scalpel, a cord clamp, a bar of soap, a pair of gloves, and the first cloth to wipe the baby clean. All this came packaged in a beautiful purse that was given to the mother as a gift after all her hard work that she carried home with pride as a symbol of prosperity. One woman reacted to this gift. She said, "Is this really mine? Can I keep it?" The other one said, "Will you give me a different color when I have my next baby?" Better yet, a woman expressed that this was the first purse that she had ever owned in her life. The kit, aside from its symbolism and its simplicity, is designed to follow globally recommended medical protocol and serves as a behavior change tool to follow steps one after the other. It can not only be used in homes, but also in institutional settings. To date, our kit has impacted over 600,000 mothers and babies around the world. It's a humbling experience to watch these numbers grow, and I cannot wait till we reach 100 million.
Nowadays, we have more ways to communicate than ever. Apart from the good old-fashioned vocal cords, emails are the most common form of communication, with 74 trillion sent every single year. That's 202 billion per day, 2 million per second, and all of them somehow end up in your mailbox. Next to email, you have WhatsApp, with 36 trillion WhatsApp messages per year. Then you've got 14 trillion WeChat messages, 7 trillion texts, 200 billion tweets, 109 billion Zoom calls, about 5 Yahoo Messenger calls, and somehow 17 million telegrams. Yes, you heard me right. The world still sends millions of telegrams every single year. That raises a few questions, like who, what, when, where, why, and how. 4 of those are pretty easy to answer. Telegrams, the world, and now. But the remaining 2, who and why, are a little more complicated. To explain why such an old and outdated technology has managed to stick around while so many others, like pagers, dial-up modems, and the iPhone 12, have all but disappeared, you need to understand just how influential and widespread telegraph systems really were. You see, when telegrams became publicly available, they were a big deal.
Most of us know about an asteroid hitting the Earth and wiping out the dinosaurs, but most people don't know that the Earth nearly got devastated by a large igneous province that formed in Siberia 250 million years ago. Now, imagine that we had to deal with a colossal LIP like that today. How much damage would it cause? Urban areas would be decimated by the rift, causing extensive destruction. And those quakes? They're just the preview. Next, the lava makes its grand entrance. Once here, it's on the warpath. Farmland needed for raising crops would be incinerated. Bodies of water like lakes, streams, and rivers would be vaporized if there was enough lava. And depending on how fast the lava flows, endangered species would be wiped out if they couldn't relocate in time. It would also devastate the economy. Schools, businesses, and hospitals would be ravaged, along with infrastructure like highways, power generating facilities, gas lines, and water mains. Oh, and that beautiful new house you bought? It's covered in lava. Your new car? It's under lava. And what about you? Well, according to Oregon State University, lava moves on a flat slope, like Hawaii's Mount Kilauea, at a maximum of 10 kilometers per hour. The average speed people walk at is 5 kilometers per hour, and average running speed is about 13 kilometers per hour. So if you were good at track and field, now's your time to shine. You could argue this kind of digital detox would be beneficial. We'd take our eyes off our screens and strike up real-life conversations with each other. We'd discover that our smartphones can actually make phone calls. We'd bring back fax machines and start making notes by hand. Well, maybe not fax machines. And hey, we'd still have TV to entertain us. The world would not fall apart. In fact, with almost 4 billion people having no access to the internet worldwide, half of humanity wouldn't notice a difference in the short term. But not you, mighty internet user. You would notice right away. If the internet suddenly flatlined, social media users would start calling each other on the phone, overloading the working telecommunication systems. Unless cell phone towers and telephone lines were also shut down. Then you'd go back to writing letters and sending them via post. Forget about wireless file transfers. With no Wi-Fi, you'd have to use a physical cable to connect 2 computers. Or a CD. Remember this? Now think about the economy. With financial data generally stored on a server, banking services largely depend on the internet. E-transfers would be impossible. Your credit card and debit card would become a useless piece of plastic.
Sometimes ignorance is preferable to the detailed truth. Maybe we only care about truth insofar as it empowers us. Knowing and thinking about all of the details of every orange tree would just be a psychological burden for the most of us. I'll take illusion over the reality. But I can't help but ask, is it possible that the mind is actually accessing a deeper kind of truth? Maybe the mind is separating the signal from the noise. But what constitutes signal versus noise? Our values. A farmer that values knowing all the details of an orange tree will view it differently than a regular person. Well, where do our values come from? Here's Nietzsche's view from beyond good and evil. Behind all logic and its seeming sovereignty of movement, there too stand valuations, or more clearly, physiological demands for the preservation of a certain type of life. For Nietzsche, our values come from our physiological demands. And what does our physiology demand? Power. It wants to survive and thrive. What does it mean to thrive? To imagine the world a certain way and to be able to make that illusion a reality. Someone could try to contest this idea by saying that they don't seek power or want to thrive. They won't eat or drink anything to prove this point. But they would still be seeking a kind of power. They imagine a world in which they prove the idea wrong, and they seek to bring that world into fruition, even at their own expense.
So it then begs the question, what if we covered the entire desert with solar panels? How much energy would we actually be able to produce, and how would this change our planet? Let's take a deep dive. For starters, let's begin here. This is the Ouarzazate Solar Power Station in Morocco, the world's largest concentrated solar power plant currently in existence and a marvel of modern engineering. Once fully completed and operational, the plant will take up an area of 25 square kilometers and be capable of producing 582 megawatts of electricity. It will even be capable of storing solar energy in the form of superheated molten salt, which allows for further production of electricity even into the night. After investing more than $9 billion into their solar energy objective, Morocco aims to create 4 additional plants similar to this one in the Sahara that will collectively create more than 2,000 megawatts of electricity production, which will be enough to provide for roughly 38% of all of Morocco's annual electricity needs. This project will transform Morocco into the world's leading solar energy state. And as the only African country that currently has a power cable linked to Europe, much of this energy will be exported for profit to the countries of the European Union. But all of this energy is created from just 5 relatively small plants.
An ant is pretty stupid. It doesn't have much of a brain, no will, no plan. And yet, many ants together are smart. An ant colony can construct complex structures. Some colonies keep farms of fungi, others take care of cattle. They can wage war or defend themselves. How is this possible? How can a bunch of stupid things do smart things together? This phenomenon is called emergence, and it's one of the most fascinating and mysterious features of our universe. In a nutshell, it describes small things forming bigger things that have different properties than the sum of their parts. Emergence is complexity arising from simplicity. And emergence is everywhere. Water has vastly different properties to the molecules that make it up, like the concept of wetness. Take wet fabric. If you zoom in far enough, there is no wetness, there are just molecules sitting in the spaces between the atoms of the cloth. Wetness is an emerging property of water, something new, only created by a lot of individual interactions between water molecules. And this is sort of it. Many things interact under a certain set of rules, creating something above and beyond themselves.
But for these things that we actually do really care about and do experience profound regret around, what does that experience feel like? Well, we all know the short answer, right? It feels terrible. Regret feels awful. But it turns out that regret feels awful in 4 very specific and consistent ways. So the first consistent component of regret is basically denial. When I went home that night after getting my tattoo, I basically stayed up all night, and for the first several hours there was exactly one thought in my head, and the thought was, make it go away. This is an unbelievably primitive emotional response. I mean, it's right up there with, I want my mommy. And we're not trying to solve the problem. We're not trying to understand how the problem came about. We just want it to vanish. The second characteristic component of regret is a sense of bewilderment. So the other thing I thought about there in my bedroom that night was, how could I have done that? What was I thinking? It's this real sense of alienation from the part of us that made a decision we regret. We can't identify with that part. We don't understand that part. And we certainly don't have any empathy for that part, which explains the third consistent component of regret, which is an intense desire to punish ourselves. That's why in the face of our regrets, the thing we consistently say is, I could have kicked myself. The fourth component here is that regret is what psychologists call perseverative. To perseverate means to focus obsessively and repeatedly on the exact same thing. Now, the effect of perseveration is to basically take these first three components of regret and put them on an infinite loop. So it's not that I sat there in my bedroom that night thinking, make it go away. It's that I sat there and I thought, make it go away, make it go away, make it go away, make it go away. So if you look at the psychological literature, these are the four consistent defining components of regret.
But if I were to ask you a similar question, what percentage of the population do you think is capable of truly mastering calculus, or understanding organic chemistry, or being able to contribute to cancer research? A lot of y'all might say, well, with a great education system, maybe 20, 30%. But what if that estimate is just based on your own experience in a non-mastery framework, your own experience with yourself or observing your peers, where you're being pushed at this set pace through classes, accumulating all these gaps. Even when you got the A, that 95%, what was that 5% that you missed? And it keeps accumulating all the way that you get to a more advanced class, and all of a sudden you hit a wall and say, oh, I'm not meant to be a cancer researcher. I'm not meant to be a physicist. I'm not meant to be a mathematician. And I suspect that that actually is the case, but if you were allowed to be operating in a mastery framework, if you were allowed to really take agency over your learning, and when you get something wrong, embrace it, view that failure as a moment of learning, that number of the percent that could really master calculus or understand organic chemistry is actually a lot closer to 100%. And this isn't even just a nice to have. I think it's a social imperative.
Now, why are companies embracing the reentry internship? Because the internship allows the employer to base their hiring decision on an actual work sample instead of a series of interviews. And the employer does not have to make that permanent hiring decision until the internship period is over. This testing out period removes the perceived risk that some managers attach to hiring relaunchers, and they are attracting excellent candidates who are turning into great hires. Think about how far we have come. Before this, most employers were not interested in engaging with relaunchers at all. But now, not only are programs being developed specifically with relaunchers in mind, but you can't even apply for these programs unless you have a gap on your resume. This is the mark of real change, of true institutional shift. Because if we can solve this problem for relaunchers, we can solve it for other career transitioners too. In fact, an employer just told me that their Veterans Return to Work program is based on their reentry internship program. And there's no reason why there can't be a retiree internship program. Different pool, same concept.
This kind of approach is kind of the way some students approach preparing for standardized tests. In order to get test scores to go up, teachers will end up teaching to the test. Now, that approach can work. Test results often do go up, but it fails the fundamental goal of education, to prepare students to succeed over the long term. So, given these obstacles, what can we do to transform the way we transform organizations So rather than being exhausting, it's actually empowering and energizing. To do that, we need to focus on 5 strategic imperatives, all of which have one thing in common: putting people first. The first imperative for putting people first is to inspire through purpose. Most transformations have financial and operational goals. These are important, and they can be energizing to leaders, but they tend not to be very motivating to most people in the organization. To motivate more broadly, the transformation needs to connect with a deeper sense of purpose. Take Lego. The Lego Group has become an extraordinary global company. Under their very capable leadership, they've actually undergone a series of transformations. While each of these has had a very specific focus, the North Star, linking and guiding all of them, has been Lego's powerful purpose: inspire and develop the builders of tomorrow. Expanding globally, it's not about increasing sales, but about giving millions of additional children access to Lego building bricks.
So the idea I'd like to propose today is this. One of the most effective ways of building strong fundamentals in students and preparing them for the future, ironically enough, is by looking to the past through the teaching of Latin. Latin will help students think more logically, communicate more effectively, and have a more comprehensive understanding of the world around them, no matter how technologically advanced that world may become. To begin with, let's address a common misconception that Latin is a dead language spoken by ancient Europeans 2,000 years ago, holding no relevance whatsoever for people living in the 21st century. There's even an old poem that expresses this point of view. Latin is a language as dead can be. First it killed the Romans, and now it's killing me. Now, students may feel this way sometimes, but this simply is not true. The reality is that Latin never died. It never came to a crashing end with the death of a single tragic figure. It simply evolved gradually over time and developed into other languages. Moreover, classical Latin is still very much alive and well in government, art, religion, literature, medicine, law, and science. It's not a dead language, it's an eternal language.
Tattoos have often been presented in popular media as either marks of the dangerous and deviant or trendy youth fads. But while tattoo styles come and go, and their meaning has differed greatly across cultures, the practice is as old as civilization itself. Decorative skin markings have been discovered in human remains all over the world, with the oldest found on a Peruvian mummy dating back to 6000 BCE. But have you ever wondered how tattooing really works? You may know that we shed our skin, losing about 30 to 40,000 skin cells per hour. That's about 1 million per day. So how come the tattoo doesn't gradually flake off along with them? The simple answer is that tattooing involves getting pigment deeper into the skin than the outermost layer that gets shed. Throughout history, different cultures have used various methods to accomplish this. But the first modern tattooing machine was modeled after Thomas Edison's engraving machine and ran on electricity. Tattooing machines used today insert tiny needles loaded with dye into the skin at a frequency of 50 to 3,000 times per minute. The needles punch through the epidermis, allowing ink to seep deep into the dermis, which is composed of collagen fibers, nerves, glands, blood vessels, and more. Every time a needle penetrates, it causes a wound that alerts the body to begin the inflammatory process, calling immune system cells to the wound site to begin repairing the skin. And it is this very process that makes tattoos permanent.
Well, according to the American Psychiatric Association, addiction is a complex condition of the brain where a person has compulsive substance use despite there being harmful consequences. People with addiction tend to have an intense focus on what they're addicted to the point where it takes over their life. What makes it so hard to break an addiction is that it can change the way your brain is wired, giving you harsh cravings that make it difficult to stop. Studies of brain imaging have even shown changes in the areas of the brain that relate to judgment, decision-making, learning, memory, and behavior control. So is this what's happening with Facebook and social media? It's hard to say for sure. That being said, we are starting to give more credit to an addiction that might be pretty similar. Video games. That's because the American Psychiatric Association includes internet gaming disorders as disorders that require further research, but that can result in clinically significant impairment or distress. The World Health Organization has also added gaming disorders to their international classification of diseases, which is used by medical practitioners around the world to diagnose conditions. Now, online video games are obviously not the same as sites like Facebook, yet they do have similar social aspects. It's possible that in the future, we'll see health organizations also classify social media as a type of an addiction or disorder. Still, sites like Facebook do have quite a few qualities that make you want to come back to them. Through constant feeds that go on forever and giving you push notifications on your phone, social media sites try their best to keep you on their app or website. And if you leave, they want you to come back as quickly as possible. Google and Facebook further their reach by also being commonly used to sign in to other sites. Social media sites always seem to have a significant impact on how you feel, furthering your connection to them. We've all heard the phrase, laughter is the best medicine. But why do we laugh in the first place? It seems that laughing might be a little more hardwired into us than you might think. Infants laugh very early in life, usually learning how to laugh before they can speak. Not only that, but people that are born blind and deaf can still exhibit laughter. One study found that the laughter produced from deaf participants was fundamentally similar to that produced by normal hearing individuals, backing up the idea that laughter is grounded in human biology.
It's also been theorized that laughter predates human speech by potentially millions of years. Being a simpler form of communication, laughter is thought to have likely helped earlier people negotiate group dynamics and establish hierarchy. I can't even imagine trying to explain that I'm a little goofball using only laughter.
So if laughter actually is instinctually part of humans, then why do people laugh? It seems like laughter is more of a way for people to better handle stress and make situations feel less threatening than laughter only being about things that we find to be funny. In practice, with a study of 1,200 people that laugh spontaneously in their natural environments, only about 10 to 20% of the laughing episodes followed anything that the researchers found to be joke-like. Finding something funny still seems to play a part in why we laugh some of the time, but laughing to make yourself feel better about your next difficult exam might be just as probable as cracking up over that joke you just heard.
But what exactly happens to your body when you're in a coma? First, we have to be clear that comas are very different from sleep, despite the fact that the origin of the word comes from the Greek for coma or deep sleep. Comas are not sleep, however, and are instead various forms of unconsciousness that render a person unable to respond to any external stimuli. You can play the loudest, heaviest death metal in the world right next to someone who's comatose, and you won't succeed in doing anything except really annoying the neighbors. Likewise, you can even physically hurt people in a coma, and they will remain completely oblivious and unresponsive. In times in the not-too-distant past, this was sometimes used as treatment, with doctors trying to shock their victims back into consciousness. Everything was tried, from exposing parts of the body to open flames, to severely dropping the body's temperature with ice, to even bloodletting from the head directly. One treatment even included wholly emptying the stomach. We guess because the doctors thought that if a patient got hungry enough, the body would force them to wake up. Or maybe they really were just throwing everything, including the kitchen sink, at the problem, which we're sure was also tried. Comas can occur as a result of serious trauma or as a deliberate medical treatment by doctors. They are typically brought on by traumatic head injury, and it's believed that it's the brain's way of shutting down so it can focus on repairing itself. They can also, however, be brought on by a stroke or a brain tumor, drug or alcohol abuse, or an illness such as diabetes or infection. Most of the time, a coma only lasts a few weeks though, but past this period, the patient can enter a persistent vegetative state that severely lessens their chance of ever coming back out of one.
Why can't we transplant brains? First of all, we should look at what the brain actually does. This thing inside our skulls that weighs on average about 3.3 pounds is larger in humans than any other vertebrae when compared to body weight. That's why we are so brainy. The busy brain is our command center for our nervous system, which takes in data from our body and gives directions to our muscles. In fact, it does so much work, it requires about 20% of our energy to run it. When we are brain dead, we no longer have any neurological activity. With the help of machines, we can be kept alive for a short time, but within a week, the body will not be able to function. While we may still be alive in some sense for that week, we are technically dead when the brain is dead. Some good news is that during the time we are kept alive, some of our other organs can be donated. But why can't we accept someone else's brain? When we transplant something such as a heart, surgeons use a mechanical pump to keep blood flowing through the body while the new heart is being put in. The new heart is then connected to the major blood vessels, and this might take several hours. You'll stay in the hospital for 1 to 2 weeks, and if your body doesn't reject its new heart, it's said 87 out of 100 people make it through the year, and 60 out of 100 get through another decade. So wouldn't it just be possible to open the skull and connect a new brain where the removed brain was connected? This question was asked to a professor of neurosurgery at Yale in 2013. He actually did say that one day this operation might be successful, but right now we are not even close. The reason is because it's just too darn difficult to connect nerve fibers from the new brain to the native spinal cord. This, he said, is why spinal cord injuries can be so devastating. If we could transplant brains, we would likely not have so many people that are disabled due to spinal injuries.
Last week we talked about how people recognize objects, and really how well people recognize objects, given how difficult the problem is, given how objects can be seen in all different sorts of illumination, in different positions, in different angles. And yet we are able to extract that information. We are able to take the visual stuff out there, interpret it in a way that allows us to recognize all the different things that we can see in our environment. Today we're going to kind of carry on looking at that. We're going to look at what's really a special class of objects. That's the human face. We're going to look at how we recognize human faces and how we do it quite as well as we do. We're really expert at recognizing faces. So again, we can think about how do we take that visual information and how do we transfer it into a form which allows us to put a name to a face and to do all the other clever things we can do with faces. So I'm going to start off again by just pointing out that it's a hard problem. Face recognition is a hard problem, and it's a clever thing we do. If you think about all the different types of faces you can recognize and all the different types of information you can get from the face, you kind of start to appreciate how well we can do face recognition.
While a written word might have multiple definitions, we can usually determine its intended meaning through context. In speech, however, a word can take on additional layers of meaning. Tone of voice, the relationship between speakers, and expectations of where a conversation will go can imbue even words that seem like filler with vital information. This is where and come in, or and tuota and eto and ano. Linguists call these filled pauses, which are a kind of hesitation phenomenon. And these seemingly insignificant interruptions are actually quite meaningful in spoken communication. For example, while a silent pause might be interpreted as a sign for others to start speaking, a filled pause can signal that you're not finished yet. Hesitation phenomena can buy time for your speech to catch up with your thoughts, or to fish out the right word for a situation. And they don't just benefit the speaker. A filled pause lets your listeners know an important word is on the way. Linguists have even found that people are more likely to remember a word if it comes after a hesitation. Hesitation phenomena aren't the only parts of speech that take on new meaning during dialogue. Words and phrases such as like, well, or you know function as discourse markers, ignoring their literal meaning to convey something about the sentence in which they appear.
The major currency of our reward system is dopamine, an important chemical or neurotransmitter. There are many dopamine receptors in the forebrain, but they're not evenly distributed. Certain areas contain dense clusters of receptors, and these dopamine hotspots are a part of our reward system. Drugs like alcohol, nicotine, or heroin send dopamine into overdrive, leading some people to constantly seek that high. In other words, to be addicted. Sugar also causes dopamine to be released, though not as violently as drugs. And sugar is rare among dopamine-inducing foods. Broccoli, for example, has no effect, which probably explains why it's so hard to get kids to eat their veggies. Speaking of healthy foods, let's say you're hungry and decide to eat a balanced meal. You do, and dopamine levels spike in the reward system hotspots. But if you eat that same dish many days in a row, dopamine levels will spike less and less, eventually leveling out. That's because when it comes to food, the brain evolved to pay special attention to new or different tastes.
Carbon dioxide, or CO2, is the main greenhouse gas in climate change. So how does CO2 get into our atmosphere? Well, carbon is part of a cycle. It starts with the sun, which hits the Earth's surface with more energy in 1 hour than the whole world uses in a year. Plants, which are kind of like biological chefs, take that sunlight and then suck in some CO2 from the air, mix them together, and bam! They create a stored form of energy in the form of carbohydrates, such as glucose and sucrose. The process is called photosynthesis. When animals like us eat those plants, our stomachs convert that food back into energy for our own growth. Greenhouse gases are a byproduct of this process and are released through waste. If those plants die, they decompose, and tiny microorganisms break down those carbohydrates and again release greenhouse gases as a byproduct. As you see, energy originates from the sun and is then transferred as it moves through the food chain. But sometimes, carbon-based organisms, like plants or animals, get stuck in the earth. When this happens, they're compressed under tons of pressure and turned into carbon-based fossil fuels like oil, coal, or natural gas.
Take a look outside a window. What is the season where you are? How do you know? Most likely, you looked at a tree or plant and noticed details about its leaves and assessed the qualities of sunlight streaming outside. Observing the timing of biological events in relation to changes in season and climate is called phenology. When you notice the daffodil buds are poking through the snow and think spring is on its way, you're using phenology. When you see leaves turn from green to red and watch migrating birds fly past and realize that summer is over, autumn is here, you're using phenology. Literally meaning the science of appearance, phenology comes from the Greek words pheno, to show or appear, and logos, to study. Humans have relied on phenology since the time of hunters and gatherers. We've watched changes in seasons to know when to plant and harvest food and when to track migrating animals. Scientists observe and document seasonal changes in nature and look for patterns in the timing of seasonal events. Timing of these natural signs has remained consistent until recently. Increasing global temperature is causing rhythms of nature to shift. Budburst, the day when a tree or plant's leaf or flower buds open, is occurring earlier in the year for some species. For every 1 degree Celsius rise in temperature, budburst happens 5 days earlier than usual. Differences in timing affect not only plants, but the insects and birds that depend on the plants for food.
It's rare to find an adult who actively still wonders what their parents think. But that isn't to say that we aren't wondering about our value in more general terms. It's just that we may, without noticing, have taken the question somewhere else, and very often to particularly harsh modern figures of authority, media, and social media. To this pitiless arena, the self-doubting person now directs all their fears of unworthiness and panic desire for reassurance. To a system set up to reward sadism and malice, they constantly raise their phones and implicitly ask, "Do I deserve to exist? Am I okay? Am I beautiful or respectful enough?" And because social media is built on the troubles of the individual soul, the verdict is never a reliable yes. One is never done with cycles of fear and reassurance seeking. Every time their spirits sink, which is often, the self-doubting sufferer picks up their phone and begs to know whether they have permission to go on. If this might be us, we should grow curious about and jealous of people who are free. They are so because someone long ago settled the question of what they were worth, and the answer has seemed solid ever since. Social media is a roar in the next valley, not a mob in their own mind. Learning from these calm souls won't just involve deleting a few apps. We will have to go further upstream, back to the baby self, whose alarmed inquiries we must quiet once and for all, with ample doses of soothing, and till now, absent kindness.
Okay, so this is the big benefit of a universal philosophy. It says it applies to everybody. Well, looks, that doesn't, 205 or 206 countries in the world, and you've got something that applies to everybody. It's a bit strange, isn't it? No, says liberal theory. There are some value structures that apply to all of us. You couldn't have the United Nations without it. It couldn't tell you that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights without this idea of values that apply to all of us just because we are humans. Now, the idea is to test that as well. Why is sport universal? Why does everybody play football? It's because the values are specified at a very thin level at the top. There are these rules and we all have to abide by just these rules. But there are lots of things about football that aren't rules specified. So Brazilian football is different from Italian football, from British football, from German football, from Spanish football. It's culturally specific, but acknowledges that there are these universal general rules that apply to everybody.
So there are two theories for how the gas giants formed. One is the same theory I showed you just now, core accretion, right? And the other is called disk instability. And one of our colleagues at DTM has done a lot of work on that. And so it's unclear exactly how they formed, but you're right, what we're trying to do, the reason we're trying to get to higher and higher pressure in the lab is because we're trying to understand more about the pressure inside the gas giants. It's thought that the gas giants also have a metallic core, but maybe a metallic core not made of iron. Hydrogen, for example, becomes metallic at a certain pressure. Okay, so it's very possible that the insides of these planets could have metallic cores, could have hydrogen cores, could have rocky portions. We're not sure, but the higher pressure we can get in the lab, the higher the pressure we can get in the lab, the closer we can get to understanding the interiors of the gas giants and the exoplanets that are so big.
Hello, everyone. Today's lecture is about setting up a website. I'm going to be focusing on things that you need to consider to ensure your website really adds value to the people using it. So, there are three main areas you need to think about. The first and most important thing is who is your target audience. When you're creating a new website, you really need to think about who the users are and what information they'll be looking for. What we do when we set up websites is to group users based on their needs. So, for a website in the academic community, for example, we may have groups such as researchers and administrators, and this helps us design the site and add information that is relevant to each group. The second point is accessibility. The main thing here is to ensure your website can be found. And you can do this by making sure it can be reached from areas on the web where your target audience are also active. So this may mean providing links on other websites, or maybe using social media. And thirdly, retention. Making sure your target audience return to your website regularly. You do this by ensuring it gives them a reason to come back, so it's important to keep the site up to date and make sure it provides the latest news and interesting information and so on.
Supersymmetry is a mathematical idea that people have developed in effort to understand the sharpest organizing principle for the fundamental constituents of matter. You see, we have learned that particles that seem to be different can actually secretly be united by certain symmetry principles. So we're used to the fact that there are symmetric objects in the world like a sphere or a basketball. You turn a sphere, and even though you've transformed it, it looks the same, fundamentally. We found that certain particles, when you transform one particle into another, even though it looks like the identity of the particle has changed, overall the equations describing it, they don't change at all, an underlying level of symmetry. But what we've not been able to do is find a symmetry that would relate certain kinds of particles, namely matter particles and force particles. Matter particles are particles like electrons and muons, quarks. Force particles are like photons and gluons and WZ bosons. Supersymmetry is a symmetry that actually relates these two kinds, these two classes of particles. And people have proven that supersymmetry is the last possible symmetry of the fundamental particles that our mathematics, reality, has not yet been shown to make use of. So people are now trying to see whether that symmetry might actually be at work in the world. Can we find evidence for it in our understanding of the fundamental particles?
In today's lecture, I'm going to talk about changes in air pollution since the middle of the last century and what has created these changes. So, by the 1950s, air pollution was very visible, with frequent thick black fogs known as smogs in many large cities around the world. The main source of this pollution was from factories, and it caused severe health problems. For example, a particularly severe smog in London in 1952 caused over 4,000 deaths. Obviously, something had to be done, and in 1956 a Clean Air Act was introduced in Britain. This addressed the pollution from factories, and the smog soon disappeared. However, as you know, these days air pollution is still a big issue. The main difference between now and the 1950s is that you can't see it, it's invisible. Also, the main source of pollution now is from cars and lorries, and although these don't produce visible signs, this air pollution is still a significant risk to health. And one of the key factors in the rise of this type of pollution is that we have all become much more vehicle dependent. There are far more cars and lorries, trains and planes than in the 1950s, and this is now the main source of air pollution around the world.
From reading philosophy, I came up with 3 principles as the guiding principles for a just city. The principles of equity, democracy, and diversity. These were derived from the works of a number of philosophers, most preeminently, I suppose, John Rawls. My choice of the word equity rather than equality is in fact based on Rawls's argument that a policy ought to distribute benefits to people where the worst off become better off. So the worst off don't have to become equal to everybody else, but no policy should in fact make those who are most disadvantaged more disadvantaged. And it means that we have to talk about the policy at the time it's being enacted. To say, well, we have to make our city more competitive because sometime in the by and by, the benefits will trickle down to those people who are worst off. Doesn't justify making them worst off at the time. We have a lot of examples in the world of people whose homes were destroyed in the name of the greater good and said, well, eventually they will benefit. But equity means that you do not, in fact, take advantage of those people who are weakest.
Conduct disorder in children is very serious. It's a disorder of childhood and adolescence that is long-term, that's chronic, where children have very aggressive impulses, where children are involved in difficulties with the law and really seem to have no disregard for the rules or for authority. When children have conduct disorder, they're definitely at risk of carrying these difficulties into adulthood, which also brings about a myriad of different problems. Children with conduct disorder often have difficulties in schools, have difficulty with relationships, and have difficulty with employment and lifelong, long-term relationships. It's important to recognize that if your child is not doing well in school, if your child has had difficulties where legal action was necessary, if your child is bullying, getting into fights, and this is constant and ongoing, if your child does not get help, these complexities will really exacerbate into other major difficulties. Look for signs of your child's grades dropping. Look for signs of repeated detentions, suspensions, and brushes with the law. Parents, please recognize that if your child has signs of conduct disorder, the sooner you get help, the sooner your child can start to learn more adaptive behaviors.
I suppose that it has always been the case for the majority of us that the first test of a work of art, or literature, or music is how much pleasure it gives us, and we don't want to bother with analysing why or how it has had such an emotional impact on us. It's always good to know what your pleasures are in the positive sense, and not as easy as some people think, as opposed to only really knowing what you don't like and complaining about it, though presumably there's some kind of pleasure to be had from that too. But now that you've chosen to take a course on the novel, I'm afraid that evaluating literature on the basis of how you feel about a book won't count as an intelligent, critical response to the work being studied. It is, however, useful to remind yourselves from time to time that we all fall for trash every now and again. For instance, you might actually enjoy listening to a catchy pop song, but you'd find it hard to explain in critical terms that it is good or better than something else just because it is enjoyable. So, you're here to sharpen up your critical knives, as it were, among other things, of course.
In an article that you wrote that I just read, you said you wished